For decades, the history of the DC Universe has been marked by its crisis-level events, status quo-altering storylines that have rewritten continuity while also providing a meta-commentary on DC Comics publishing itself, and all under a signature red glow. This is Red Skies, a 13-part podcast epic mining these events and the Superman of it all. Welcome to Digging for Kryptonite, a Superman fan journey. I'm your host, Anthony Desiato. This is Red Skies, Chapter 12. And joining me to discuss Death Metal by Scott Snyder and Greg Capullo, as well as the second half of Scott Snyder's Justice League run, is the host of the Discovery Debrief and the Comic Binge podcast's returning guest, Chris Clow. Welcome back.
Thank you so much for having me, Anthony. I really appreciate it.
I'm happy to have you here for the penultimate installment of our big crisis event here. I poured myself a nice glass of bourbon, which I'm enjoying as we record. I debated whether or not to go with coffee or bourbon. Coffee, I feel like, would have been akin to crisis energy, would have gotten me, kind of amped up. And I decided to go with anti-crisis energy in the form of bourbon to just kind of relax me as we make our way through this material. So hopefully I made the right choice.
I think you did, and it aligns thematically with everything that we're going to be talking about today. So I'm looking forward to it. It's going to be fun.
Yes. I will say at the outset, for anyone who listened to our Dark Knights Metal episode, as well as anyone who's been following my social media posts as I've been making my way through what we're about to talk about, you might expect me to come in a little hot and a little hard on Death Metal. And I'm happy to report, this is always a journey and there are surprises and you never know where things are going to land. And I will say that I had, I guess, I have a more positive outlook on this than I thought I was going to when we were, in the process of setting this up. And I'll talk about it. A lot of the issues that I had with Metal are still present here. So to be fair, that's all still at play. But I think I came away from Death Metal with a much clearer sense of what Scott Snyder was trying to say through Dark Knight's Metal and Dark Knight's Death Metal and the Justice League run. And there's a lot about it that honestly I just sort of have a fundamental disagreement with, but that's fine, right? We can kind of look at things in different ways. But having a clearer sense of really kind of what he was trying to get at helped a lot. So we'll get into all of this. Let me toss it to you first. A question that I've been asking a lot of the guests, just kind of as a preliminary matter. Death Metal, if we even want to go back to Metal itself, Snyder's Batman run, if we really want to kick it back, the Justice League run, Snyder's DC work as a whole, sort of what has your relationship been with it, and how, if at all, has it changed over the years?
Well, as you know, one trait that we have in common is that we both have a history working as comic book retailers. So the first time that I remember encountering Scott Snyder's name, period, was when we got our copies in of American Vampire #1. That was the first time I saw his name on a book. I read a little bit more about him, and it sounds like he was something of a protege of Stephen King's, and I thought that was interesting. I read American Vampire back when this was well before Black Label stuff, and the books were still called Vertigo books. And I was very taken with how imaginative it was and how scary it was too. Like, I was actually pretty surprised that, wow, I'm feeling a little bit of fear from this book. That's fascinating to me. So a few months go by, or maybe it was a year goes by, and they announced Snyder as the new ongoing writer for Detective Comics. And I remember thinking, wow, he's jumping to Batman really fast. Of course, the caveat being at that time that Dick Grayson was leading Detective Comics and Bruce Wayne was not. So it was going to be a little bit of a different flavor. And then when that first issue of Black Mirror came out, I think it was Detective number 870, I was shocked at how fun of a reading experience that was and how dangerous it felt, because it didn't seem like there was an abundance of danger in that way to be found in a book led by Dick Grayson. So, Snyder actually was the writer who was able to finish out the original run of Detective Comics, and then shortly before the books launched is when we got a glimpse of what the new 52 was going to be, and Snyder jumping over to Bruce Wayne and with Batman #1 seemed like a very natural fit. I read his Batman run from Detective up through the new 52 stuff religiously. I was very taken with what he was doing up through about the first 20 issues, I think. And this is where I think a critical point comes into play, at least in my mind, is that when you read the Black Mirror and you read stories like The Court of Owls, you get a sense that Snyder is going kind of one way as a writer. Like he's going to be the guy who brings this visceral, emotional kind of quality. He's going to bring this horror quality to the kinds of stories that he's going to tell. And then there's kind of an about face with Zero Year, his very ambitious sort of reshaping of Batman's origin story for the new 52. And full disclosure, my all time favorite Batman story is probably Year One. So when it became clear over the course of reading Zero Year that it was going to supplant Year One, not just add to it, but actually supplant it, all of a sudden I started feeling very defensive about what Snyder's intentions were by reshaping Batman's origin story. Um, Zero Year as a story, one thing that is going to come up, I think, a lot over the course of this conversation, especially if we want to bring the first metal into it, is that I always appreciate creators who have ambition. Whether or not that ambition is met is a whole other issue. And I think with Zero Year, he bit off way more than he could chew. That story was all over the place. It was not a smooth reading experience, and reading it month to month was an exercise, at least for me, in frustration. It went on for a very long time, and the entire DCU was sort of getting into it as well. And it was kind of hard for me to read that story because I just fundamentally had so many different kinds of issues with it. I actually revisited it recently. It's still not my favorite, but I think it does read a lot better in collected form. But Zero Year, I think, is where we first got the glimpse of the kind of storytelling that he, excuse me, that he would move into with metal. And metal itself, I remember I was part of a podcast at the time that book started. And I was like, "Oh, it's gonna be fun. It's a new DC event." Scott Snyder is kind of a guy who's generally accessible in the kinds of stories that he's gonna put out. And then I think it was either the casting or the Forge. I think it was the casting was the first book, and I said, "Hey guys, read the casting. Let's get into this new DC crossover event." And they were totally lost. And I had to explain things going back to the 60s and 70s in DC continuity that I did not think I would have to explain. And then as metal went on, like again, I appreciate the ambition. I was rather shocked at the kinds of stakes that Snyder was going to be putting into that story, but that story was what it was, and it told, or it gave us a glimpse at what Snyder was going to end up doing in Justice League. Then his Justice League run, I actually fell off of about 20 issues in because personal things. I was moving across the country at the time and just kind of lost it. But as I revisited those stories relatively recently in preparation for this show, uh, I feel like he refined the ambition a bit, but he didn't necessarily lose the scale. And when it comes to death metal, it is very much a more focused, refined, and I would argue more celebratory version of what we got in metal.
I think that's all fair. And it's particularly great to get your insight on Snyder's Batman run. As I talked about when we covered Metal a couple of weeks ago, I only ever read the Court of Owls arc. I always intended to finish the run as one of those things that's always on that long term to do list. And I just never got to it. And I knew I had enough material to cover for metal and death metal that tacking on Snyder's Batman run was just not in the cards. But it's interesting to hear that for sure. And I will say, yeah, with death metal overall, I definitely found it to be more engaging and readable than metal itself was for me. So one of the things that I guess really the main thing that I took Snyder to task for when we covered metal, and even in that episode though, I did recognize, and I will reiterate it here, that I think ultimately it's a matter of preference or taste, right? I don't even say this necessarily as a criticism that Snyder did anything wrong. Like I recognize there are fans who probably ate all of this up. It just wasn't necessarily for me. And what I'm pointing to specifically is what I found to be exhaustive, tiresome, and just relentless world building, right? There was so much about the architecture of the cosmology of the DC multiverse, omniverse, as we ultimately get. And we talked about it in metal as far as the World Forge and the Master Forger and Barbatos and everything that we talked about, the dark multiverse most of all. And that continues here, right? We get more pieces of the puzzle in the sixth dimension arc of Snyder's Justice League run. We learn that there is this sixth dimension that functions as the quote unquote control room, right, of the multiverse and populated by Perpetua, right, who gave rise to the original multiverse that was founded using these dark forces, right? And she has her children, the Monitor, the Anti-Monitor, and the Forger, right? And they occupy this space in the control room. And eventually, these sons of hers, primarily the Monitor, right, realized that she had usurped her function, right, as one of the hands giving birth to the multiverse and conspired to overthrow her. And they called upon the source that is the power from which everything flows. And the source intervened in the form of this raptor that imprisoned Perpetua within the source wall and separated this multiverse from the other multiverses within the omniverse. And essentially discarded that original multiverse created by Perpetua and gave rise to the original multiverse that we came to know, I suppose, in pre-crisis continuity before that was undone. And there's, of course, more to unpack here, but that's just an example, right, of the continued architecture that gets built within these Snyder works, right? So as I am starting my reading of Sixth Dimension, right, the first part of my reading for this episode, I'm hitting all of this stuff that I just laid out here. And I am like banging my head against the wall. I'm like, it's just more of this. It's never ending. I will say that as we continue to move forward, I think we get to a certain point where the world building eases up a bit, and that was welcome for me. But like I was saying earlier, I think it became clear over the course of the rest of the run, and especially as we get into death metal, Snyder's whole thesis about how everyone and everything is connected and the importance of this long history that we generally, but specifically the characters within this shared universe have all experienced together. And with that in mind, and especially after I finished all of the reading, and then I went back and I was kind of going through everything again, seeing how some of these pieces fit together in that sixth dimension arc in particular, when Clark is trapped in that void and he's removed from the sunlight and he's trapped and he's having these memories of John, his son, and Pa Kent, right? And this idea comes into play at this point as well, right? About how again, this experience stretches across generations, right? This idea that anytime these heroes are battling, they're not just battling in that particular moment, right? It's a shared battle that they've all been waging across history. And this idea of connectedness, right? That was one of the things that I bumped up against in the prior episode, and I did continue to bump up against it here, to be clear. But that was the thing. I felt like we were drawing these connection points between every aspect of the DC universe, and I felt like we were undermining the importance of mystery, of chance, of fate, right? And I feel like at a certain point, it just sort of undermines those other aspects to sort of over explain or to draw all of these lines between things. But within the context of, I suppose, Snyder's larger point, I guess I got it. I don't necessarily disagree with it, and I'll continue to talk about that. But I guess that understanding at least allowed me to come to terms with the work more so here than I did last time.
Yeah, it's funny hearing you mention that because the idea of over explaining and overbuilding, especially when it comes to these extra cosmic components of the DC universe, because we're far beyond like even the new gods, right? We're talking about the entirety of the omniverse and the like the creation of Perpetua and her role from the hands and all of these things. And I absolutely agree with you. The mystery has been taken away. What I guess I kind of gravitated toward was more a point of these stakes. Great storytelling, I think, has identifiable stakes. It's arguably something that afflicts superhero media generally, but most especially movies these days. The stakes get so big and so unwieldy that it's very difficult to have a grasp of what really is being fought for. It's not a problem that I felt with Final Crisis. I feel like Final Crisis, weirdly enough, is a smaller scale story than the metal death metal saga is, and Sixth Dimension absolutely counts in that. Um, Justice Doomore kind of flows in and out of it, but is still kind of a component of it, and arguably a pretty important story to read headed into death metal. But yeah, the stakes combined with the world building, I hadn't really thought about it in such terms, but hearing you say that makes it make complete sense. It's just like when you combine the over explanation of the cosmology with things that are just really difficult to grasp, especially in a story that at the end of the day is about being together. I just wonder if there might be a thematic mismatch with the heavy work that's done in the plot. And Snyder, but that's the thing too, is that in Sixth Dimension, one of the things that I think you absolutely glimpse is Snyder's incredible strength when it comes to character moments and writing the characters specifically. When Superman looks back and says, "Hey, it's going to be okay," you believe it before he gets lost in that void. And like the way that the heroes encounter this, what they believe to be this future idyllic version of the DC universe, like they all feel it in their cores. Like this is what it looks like when we win. Even Batman gets to see what it looks like when he wins, even if he understands what the cost is supposed to be in the moment before everything is actually revealed to him. So it's one of those things where, in Black Mirror and certainly in Court of Owls, the character work is so, so strong. And Court of Owls, the stakes aren't nearly as high, but because the stakes are more closely aligned with the intimacy, I guess, of the character work, it feels like it's much easier to connect to. But like you, as time goes on in death metal proper, and even some of the ancillary material, it's a little easier to grasp. It doesn't necessarily lose the scale, but it does provide, I think at least, readers more of a way in to understand exactly what he's trying to say.
Yes, it's interesting because we were talking off mic about Grant Morrison, and certainly we've covered a lot of Morrison on this show generally, and especially in the context of this Red Skies event. And we spent a lot of time on Final Crisis. And I guess before I go further, let me say this cuts both ways, because part of me says, hey, we don't need to discuss death metal by putting it up against these other works per se, but at the same time, I feel like that's not only fair, but it's natural, and it's death metal kind of begs that in and of itself, right? It's a crisis about being a crisis. So I feel like these comparisons are warranted. And I know one of the things we had messaged about was Doomsday Clock. Now I've already recorded that episode. People will have heard it by the time this comes out. And the way that Doomsday Clock and death metal circle each other I do want to touch on that because I have some feelings about that. And that was, we spent a while talking about Doomsday Clock last week, and yeah, that was an instance where yes, we got into these larger questions about how the DC universe slash multiverse functions, but to me, it was grounded in a more emotional core that I feel like is often lost in these kind of stories. And this is sort of the tragedy of it. And I've gotten a sense, I think, because again, we've had our metal episode out, and I've gotten feedback from listeners, and I appreciate everyone who's tuned in and has shared their take on all of this. And one of the things that's come up as I've traded comments and messages with people is like, yeah, there are some really cool ideas at play in these metal events. But I think when you combine the over explaining and the world building with, again, these impossibly high stakes, right? It's the nature of everything at stake. And what's crazy is that that's sort of always the case when we're talking about a crisis event. But somehow, as we get into the idea that our multiverse exists within a larger multiverse, a larger omniverse populated by other multiverses, it's like it gets even bigger. And so I think with all of that, there are aspects that get lost in the shuffle, but there are some really cool ideas here. And when you do get moments like what you cited, right, as Superman accepts this challenge to go into the sixth dimension and see what they can learn there. And he turns back and he looks at everyone. He's like, hey, it's going to be okay. That image, I've seen that circulated on social media so many times, and I never knew what it was from. And so as I was reading this, I came to it and I was like, finally, mystery solved here. But uh, I guess two other things by way of setup, I suppose. So one is just in terms of audience feedback. I've gotten the sense just from hearing from our digging for kryptonite audience. I'm not trying to cast a wide net and say this is all comics fans, but I think particularly people who are following this show and who are Superman fans, I've gotten the sense that with these metal events, a lot of folks either really not on board with them or didn't read them. So as we're going through all of this, and I know there are exceptions and it's a mix of people who are listening, but at least from what I've been hearing from people, I feel like an audience, correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like we're largely talking to folks who again, yeah, might not have been totally on board with this or might have skipped it altogether. I mean, when we look at these crisis events, most of them until this point have been pretty Superman centric, right? I mean, my Infinite Crisis and Final Crisis, most of all. And then as we get into these meta and Doomsday Clock certainly, but as we get into these metal events, Superman of course has his part to play, and there are some particular instances that I definitely want to talk about. And we've already cited one with the hey, it's going to be okay, but these aren't Superman stories the way I would consider, and I do consider Doomsday Clock to be a Superman story. So again, as we're kind of talking about this to people and explaining this to people, I want to make sure I keep that in mind. And this is where it's a fine line, because if we were to do a beat by beat plot breakdown, we would be here for. I mean, our episodes are long to begin with. We would be here forever.
We
So
would
I
be
don't.
here until the red sun comes around that actually envelops the darkest night if we did that. Yeah.
Yeah, so I won't do that, but I do want to give people, again, an overview of some context for what we're talking about. And I'm going to cede the floor to our pal Superboy Prime. So there's a special that's part of the death metal event called Secret Origin, and it's co-written by Jeff Johns and Scott Snyder. A rare collab between the two of them. I can't think of many, if any, others. So I think it was kind of a big moment for the two of them to write this together. And we're deep into the story now. We're towards the end of Death Metal here. But Superboy Prime says, some lame Batman wannabe is doing what a bunch of other villains have already tried to do for some reason: remake the entire multiverse in their vision. I feel like I've already read this story, but I understood it better. Everything in the universe is turned upside down and jumbled like a greatest and worst hits album. I can't figure out what's going on. And the worst part about it all is, I don't care anymore. Now, of course, we're not going to leave it at that. That would be doing this work a disservice if that's the only description we gave of this story. And we've grown accustomed now to the use of Superboy Prime as the stand-in for the fanboy who's outraged at what's going on in the pages of the comics, this real meta commentary. At the same time, though, I don't know, it's like, what do you make of that? What do you make of that? Because on the one hand, it's like, oh, we're kind of taking the piss out of what people's complaints might be about this, but part of me says, oh, it's a little bit too on the money here. How do you feel about it?
Oh, I'm so glad that you brought that issue up and that moment specifically up, just because, you know, Superboy Prime first appears when the heroes are going back to the worlds in the multiverse where those crises events are happening in perpetuity, to try and find a way to redirect the crisis energy to the Mobius chair. A lot of words that I just said right there. um, and I remember thinking in the moment, this doesn't sound like Superboy Prime. There's a disconnect here because I love Infinite Crisis a lot. That was probably the story that defined my DC reading. It came at a critical sort of embryonic stage of my comic book fandom as I understand it today. So Superboy Prime holds a lot of real estate in my head when it comes to Crisis villains in particular. And of course, his role in the Sinestro Corps War up through even, the stuff that was included in Blackest Night. So seeing Superboy Prime again was a thrill, but he didn't feel very authentic. And then this issue comes along, and the voice is just pitch perfect for everything that we understand. And Johns is really a creator, I think, that played with the meta commentary and kind of established what a meta commentary in a crisis event looks like and how it can invoke the feelings of a wide swath, maybe not the widest swath, but a wide swath of the readership, to use that to tell a component of the story. And when I read that, I could not help but just laugh out loud, first of all, at how truthful it felt, but also, it seemed like such a treat to be reading that story specifically as someone who has been so invested in Superboy Prime, and in a way that sort of brings his story full circle, in such a familiar way. But yeah, I mean, what's that other meme? No lies detected. I mean, that's kind of how I do feel about it. But you also have to keep in mind, and I know you keep this in mind, but people reading that story definitely need to keep in mind that Superboy Prime is not necessarily the most reliable narrator either. He is an extraordinarily jaded kid who has power that arguably he doesn't deserve, at least for most of the time that we see him. And even when you read that issue, he overhears everybody muttering under their breath, he's poison, I don't want to get near him, it's just terrible. And you can see the way that Francis Manipul, and Ivan Reese, I think, also had a hand in that issue. The way they drew his face just hardened and resigned at the same time. Like, it was a very rewarding element to this entire experience, and I'm so glad that it's included here, even though, all things considered, it's not a super important part of the story. But for those of us that have been around and have been reading these crises maybe since Infinite Crisis, that is something that I think adds some additional legitimacy to the historical components of it. Because Infinite Crisis now is getting close to 20 years old, and which is wild to think about. But and sorry, it dates both you and I think a little bit, but uh, that issue really does sort of exemplify how far back this story wants to go in terms of bringing the thematic aims of every crisis we've seen up to this point to something of a satisfying conclusion. And reading that issue, that's what started to make me realize that, obviously we're going to have crossover events in the future. I don't know how they could possibly get bigger than this. Famous last words, but I can't fathom it at this point. I couldn't fathom this one too, to be fair. But bringing that in, and I think bringing Johns's authoritative voice for Superboy Prime in also helped to telegraph before the finale that this is going to be something of a conclusion for every crisis we've encountered up to this point. And I was already more on board with it before reading Secret Origin, but after that point specifically, that's when I started to feel like, yeah, this is a real end, and maybe that's okay.
I'm glad you bring that up. So we will continue to unpack this next week when we cover Dark Crisis on Infinite Earths. But a couple of things on that note, as you read this, even putting aside the mechanics of where we end up, it does feel like it's so, instead of saying exhausting, I'll say it's so exhaustive and it's so comprehensive, right? And again, the stakes are so high, and it shines a light on every, seemingly every conceivable inner working of how our universe, the DC universe, fits within its multiverse, which fits within the larger omniverse, right? And so it does sort of leave you with the sense of, okay, we've done it. We've done it. And then moving more into the mechanics of it, and I'm skipping ahead to the very end here, but we end up with this, and I believe the quote is an infinite web of multiverses, right? And now the barriers have been shattered, and we have this infinite frontier, right? Which was the publishing initiative and the name of a mini series that followed Death Metal. So this idea that everything has been restored, and the characters' memories and experiences of all of the versions we've seen of them within the core DC universe, even as that DC universe has changed, all of that has been reinstated, right? It really feels like, okay, we've done it. And yet, this Death Metal was 2020 to the beginning of 2021, I believe. And then very shortly thereafter, we had Dark Crisis on Infinite Earths. And I'm going to do my full homework very shortly, but I have dabbled a little bit. I've perused Dark Crisis, and my understanding is, in addition to kind of showing how the younger, the next generation of the DC universe rises up, right, which seems to be the heart of it. But as far as the crisis piece of it, we have Pariah coming back and ultimately bringing about the restoration of his multiverse of infinite Earths. And I mean, I'm heading into that episode. I'm already at a deficit here, or it's at a deficit in my book, because I'm like, what was the point of having this infinite web of multiverses if if we have to have this event a year later? I mean, and that's not I mean, that's not a criticism of death metal, but I guess if we're kind of looking at the larger kind of publishing initiatives and aims of DC Comics, it's like, what are we doing here?
Yeah, I wonder if there were people that maybe were counting on people, or I wonder if DC itself was maybe counting on the idea of people jumping off when Death Metal was finished, because for all intents and purposes, the end of Death Metal is the end of Scott Snyder's major involvement in the DC universe. And it's conceivable that some people are going to step away, at least from like the event side of DC Comics, with his exit. But no, I mean, I'm with you. I remember kind of chafing at when it became clear that Dark Crisis was actually Crisis on Infinite Earths. And full disclosure, I have not read the story, although I plan to pretty shortly, and I have more motivation to now after finishing Death Metal. Um, they called it the sequel to Crisis on Infinite Earths, and it's like, I remember reading something like that in 2005 that claimed the same thing, that was a 20-year anniversary celebration of Crisis on Infinite Earths, and brought back the characters that original story ended with to try and push things into a new tomorrow, which had quite a lot of gas in front of it. But yeah, I do remember just thinking that this event, that first of all, yes, it's arriving so soon after death metal, but also, uh is this supposed to be something of a new beginning, in the sense that they're trying to bring a different segment of readers on board? And legacy, I think, is one of the strongest elements of the DC Comics universe, especially in comparison to Marvel's only really just now, over the past decade or so, getting into the legacy kind of game, especially with Miles Morales and with Sam Wilson as Captain America, and great additions to those mantles, of course. But they're only just now doing that. And legacy has been such a critical component of DC Comics identity for decades. I mean, I know people who still believe that Kyle Rayner is the Green Lantern. Connor Hawke is the Green Arrow. A lot of people believe Wally West is the Flash, right? And you know, Nightwing is not to be trifled with. People wanted to burn Dan DiDio's name in effigy when there was a rumor that came out that said he wanted to kill Dick Grayson in Infinite Crisis. And so by bringing in these other newer legacy characters with Infinite Frontier and pushing into Dark Crisis on Infinite Earths, are they trying to say that we are now committed to a new form of storytelling that maybe some older fans don't like? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know, but I feel like that's something that someone could conclude by looking at the way that the line is set up. And you know what I have read of those legacy stories with these newer characters, especially Wonder Woman and John Kent as Superman, and the new Batman when they did the Future State. A lot of those have a lot of potential, and I'm really interested to see where things go in the future. But did they see death metal as like a break off point? I don't think we'll ever really know the answer to a question like that, but I can't help but think maybe it's possible.
Maybe, maybe. And you mentioned Infinite Crisis, so this kind of leads me to the next big ticket item that I wanted to bring up here. And again, just by way of, again, for our audience who's like, what the hell is death metal about? So,
Yeah.
essentially, and this is continuing from Dark Knight's Metal, which introduced again this whole concept of the dark multiverse and the Batman Who Laughs and all that business that we already talked about. We already did 2 hours on that, so go back and listen to that. But essentially here you have Perpetua and her acolyte Lex Luthor, who becomes Apex Predator. We have to talk about this. I have very strong feelings on that.
Apex Lex, yeah.
Yeah. Oh God. But essentially, they are trying to uh, essentially sway the nature of this world towards doom, which will unlock the seventh and final dark force that powers Perpetua, in this case, faithlessness, right? And when the universe turns towards doom, she will rise and her powers will be unlocked. And by the time we get to the end of Snyder's Justice League run, that's what happens, right? Perpetua has risen and her powers are realized. And the Justice League, and I know I'm skipping and we'll go back to anything that we want to talk about, but just to sort of lay this out for people. And it ends with the Justice League kind of, raging into battle here with Perpetua, which then happens off panel, which, man, if there was ever a choice, if there was ever a
Oh
choice, like
yeah.
that's a choice. That's such a choice to be like, I've done the metal event and a 39 issue Justice League run. That's all about first the totality, and then we find out it houses Perpetua, and she created this original multiverse, and she's rising, and she wants to remake the universe in her image. All of this, right? She in the prior multiverse, she combined humans and Martians to form these apex predators. And it's like we're ending with them racing into battle here, and it's like, well, you're not going to see it. You'll see the aftermath of it in Death Metal, where the Justice League has lost. The Justice League has lost, and Perpetua now is in the process of remaking the multiverse to what she wants it to be. But she's challenged by her other acolyte, the Batman Who Laughs, who takes on yet another form as the Darkest Night when, via a brain transplant, he inhabits the body of a Bruce Wayne from another dark multiverse world who had become the equivalent of Dr. Manhattan. For anyone who hasn't read this and you're hearing us talk about it, you must be like, I don't know what you think. What the hell are these guys talking about? But yes, the Batman Who Laughs takes on this final form as the Darkest Night, and the way that it is achieved is that his underlings transplant his brain after Wonder Woman kills him, and they place it in the body of another Bruce Wayne from the multiverse who had acquired the equivalent of the powers of Dr. Manhattan. And this allows the Batman Who Laughs to take on this final form as the Darkest Night, who rises to challenge Perpetua, right, to remake the universe in his own image. And so our heroes have to try to defeat them. And the further piece of architecture that we get here, we had learned about the seven forces, the positive forces and then the dark forces that are at play in the universe here. Just as an example, the speed force versus the still force, right? And Perpetua, when she created the multiverse initially, she based it on those dark forces, and that's what she's trying to bring back. And when the multiverse had been remade, right, it was built on these positive forces. And and I've lost my
Which,
train of thought. Where am I going with that?
no, look, you are actually parsing it out in a way that I think is as clearly understandable as possible for people who've never touched this story. So kudos to you.
And what we thank you. And what we find out is that those forces, the positive and the dark forces, they all revolve around two poles. So there's connective energy, right, which later comes to be known as anti-crisis energy, and that's the energy that pertains to this sense of connectedness that we're talking about. That's not focused on the individual and the moment, but rather everyone together and this larger shared history. The crisis energy, right? That's all about the individual, the selfish pursuits, the selfish need, uh, and so that's so we have the connective energy and the crisis energy, and again, you had mentioned this earlier. As we get deeper into death metal, we have our heroes venture into the dark multiverse where prior crises are still occurring. As long as people remember them, they're still happening in the dark multiverse. Which begs a question, because especially with Crisis on Infinite Earths, it's like they don't remember it. So how is this still happening? They only seem to remember a very vague notion of it, but whatever. And so that becomes a big part of it, right? Where they try to go to the where they do go to the dark multiverse, and the idea is to try to use this crisis energy to stop these opponents and to restart the universe. So again, that's I think overall, I think a pretty good, pretty good overview
Yeah.
of kind of what's at play here. So we'll get back to all of that, but what I wanted to get to was especially talking about Final Crisis or Infinite Crisis rather. One of the things that's come up on the podcast, and I will forever say this, and I think you would probably agree as a fellow fan of that era, was that I think from an editorial perspective and due to the collaboration of the writers of the DC universe at the time, and especially the quartet who would go on to do 52, there was such a level of coordination.
Mm.
And, whether you liked it or didn't, and I know we did, and I think generally it was well received, it's like it really felt like for a good period of time from Identity Crisis through 52 and even Final Crisis, I would argue, it really felt like, okay, we're kind of on a path here and everybody feels like they're on the same page. This era feels very different. Uh,
Yes.
it feels like we have Jeff Johns and we have Brian Michael Bendis and we have Scott Snyder, and everybody's kind of doing their own thing here as far as charting the future of the DC universe and explaining how the DC universe works and trying to glean some kind of sense of how Doomsday Clock and death metal fit together is a question that I will now pose to you. What is your understanding of
Oh
that?
boy. That's that. I honestly don't know if that's a question that has an answer to it, because the stories exist in such isolation from each other that it's kind of difficult to parse. I mean, Doomsday Clock ended with so many potential paths forward. Even a potential crossover with Marvel at some point in the future. Like he put a seed in there. So if it ever happens, then Jeff Johns and Gary Frank can take credit for it. But I don't know. I mean, the aims of the stories, I think, really provide a dividing line because Doomsday Clock, I would argue, there is a higher degree of enjoyment for that story if you are a pretty big fan of Superman. It is a pie-in to Superman at the end of the day. That's one of the reasons that I love it so much. So many people were focused on it's a Watchmen sequel. How can it possibly be a good thing or a good contribution? But it uses Watchmen to tell us a story about Superman. So that's one of the reasons I love it as much as I do. Um, and then with death metal, it seeks to be such a comment on the nature of crisis storytelling itself, and a desire, I think, that a lot of fans have had to knock barriers down. Not to get too far ahead, but I mean that's ultimately what one of the primary results is. That it's very difficult to compare them, especially considering that leading into Infinite Frontier, uh, there doesn't seem to be much retention of a lot of the things that ended Doomsday Clock. At least that's my perception. So I think it's best, if you want to headcanon it, you can, and there's enough connective tissue between the two stories just by the inclusion of a form of Dr. Manhattan. But the aims of the stories are so very different. I mean, coming out of Rebirth and all of the stories like in the wider DC universe that fed into Doomsday Clock, it was basically a reconciliation for the New 52. And death metal, like everything that the story seems to want to do, is like, all right, we'll do that, but more. We're going to reconcile everything you've ever seen with these characters to try and push toward a brand new beginning. So this is a total reset. It's almost like the creative team, and Snyder in particular, and I'm sure some of his most direct collaborators, were trying to say, look, let's build this in so that this is the biggest possible reset that the DC universe can do now and maybe can ever do. Because if you're saying this is a whole new beginning, then conceivably every slate going forward is going to have to start here. And Doomsday Clock wasn't necessarily interested in doing that. It was interested in reconciling stories and characters, frankly, that had been lost in the New 52 era, while building around the history and idea, really, of Superman. So it's hard for me to connect the two, frankly. Like, I guess you can do it in a headcanon sense just by saying that uh, Dr. Manhattan is not the final authority on power in this shared universe. Instead, now it has to be the Hands, and descended from that, it has to be Perpetua. But the mechanics still, like, when you're reading the story, I think it's easy enough to understand them, but I actually found Multiversity a far easier reading experience. Maybe it's because there's less material overall, but Grant Morrison generally had a pretty straight and narrow idea of the kinds of stories that he wanted to tell by bringing in all of these other kinds of mechanical components of the multiverse as Morrison saw it. But here it's just like, let's go big, let's go big, let's go big, and then we'll shrink it down. And those other stories weren't really interested in doing that. They were a little more character focused. Even Multiversity, which is huge canvas of storytelling, but again, we're going back to the idea of plot versus character, and the plot just kind of gobbles the character of the metal storytelling. Even though, like I said at the top, uh, it's an it's a more streamlined read here than it was in metal. I said a lot of things. It's like a word salad. Like, I feel like it's hard to avoid when it comes to talking.
I know it's funny. So due to our time difference, so we're recording this, and it's probably pushing midnight my time. I've had my glass of bourbon here. I've been reading Crises for the past 3 months, so I feel like a little punchy at this moment. Like, I hope this all makes sense to people, and or at least that they're having some fun with this. But I know that, not to. It's funny because we're talking about this death metal event that is this very meta commentary on the kind of event that it is. Similarly here, like, I'll talk about talking about this for a moment, because I think one of the things that's challenging about this, like when we did Doomsday Clock last week, a few minutes in, man, I was tearing up talking about Dr. Manhattan's whole thesis about the rocket arrives, or a rocket arrives, the child is loved, Superman is made, right? Like that idea. and I'm tearing up as I'm talking about it. Here, I feel like the moments like those are essentially non-existent for me, or if few and far between, if any. And that's the thing that I think makes it a little hard to talk about these metal events, is that they are so plot heavy, and I don't necessarily enjoy sitting here for the amount of time that we do and just sort of saying this happens and then this happens and then this happens. Like, it's more interesting when we can talk about what it means, right? Or how it resonates with us. But they are so mechanical, right? In terms of what they're explaining, what they're setting up, that I think it does kind of pose a little bit of a challenge. Side note, so I don't think we said this in the metal episode, but I know that I think it was Snyder. There was some desire from someone at some point to call at least one of these metal events Dark Crisis, right? And then, but that didn't move forward, right? And of course, that title would then be used by the Josh Williamson story that we'll talk about next week. So it's weird because with metal and death metal, we're talking about two events that don't have crisis in the title, but yo, they crisis harder than just about anything else that we've talked about or will talk about. And it's kind of heartbreaking to me that it doesn't have crisis in the title for that reason. And I also feel like because they talk so much about being a crisis, it should have been called Meta Crisis. And you could have
Oh
done
yeah.
listen, man, you could have done this whole thing where you have Metal Crisis in your logo, and then the L is like hanging off. It would have been, oh man, it would have been perfect, right? Because you think, all right, metal crisis, but no, it's a meta crisis. It's a crisis about being a crisis, and crisis energy and anti-crisis energies, all this stuff going on. That's what this should have been called. This should have been called Meta Crisis with the L hanging off there.
No, hey, I think that that's a great idea. They should. I mean, look, they retitled Dark Crisis to Dark Crisis on Infinite Earths in the middle of the run. It's not too late, really. It's never too late. Although you never know. I mean, uh, if Snyder and Capullo end up coming back to do a follow up to this, I mean, look, I kind of hope it doesn't happen because like I can't imagine how you must feel, especially considering our time difference and all of the other crises events that you have read. But I'm tired after reading this, and it's not a bad tired. I don't want to try and throw shade on it because I feel like that's easy to glean from some of the things that we're talking about. I think we both came away generally enjoying the story, especially with the feeling that it is designed to leave us with, a sense of possibility and a sense of connectedness. My understanding is that the theme of connectedness and certainly the theme of truth is a critical component to what the story is trying to say, especially coming out of the shared collective trauma that the entire world went through during the COVID-19 pandemic, or at least the darkest days of it. There was, and honestly, there still continues to be a deficit of connection between people. We all saw those stories that emerged after people started getting on airplanes again of these terrible behaviors that people would have, and this sense of trust that we've lost in our shared institutions and all of these things. I do feel like death metal has something to say about all of that, even though it was a story that was kind of coming out in the middle of it. It is difficult to parse those themes outside of the absorption of the end, but you need to read everything to get to the end and to fully grasp what it is doing. But I do feel like it's quite possible that a lot of people might have jumped off before that point because of the density of the plot.
I know I definitely could see that happening. Again, there's a lot of talk of how Snyder is so clearly inspired by Morrison, and when I talked about this last time, and I don't say this to be mean, but with Morrison, and I think anyone who's read Morrison knows exactly what I'm talking about. Where sometimes you read a Morrison story and you're like, "What? I don't know exactly what happened or what it means," and sometimes that can be a put off, right? And I know there are people who have read Final Crisis, for example, like I don't know what this is, and they kind of cast it aside. I've been in that category, so I know.
Sure.
But if you spend the time with it, right, I think it ultimately proves rewarding. And you say, okay, I get kind of what's going on, but I get what this is trying to say. With Snyder, again, there's an element of that at play, and I don't say this to be mean, but I also feel like it, I don't, and again, audience correct me if you feel otherwise, I don't think any of the metal stuff is hard to understand or follow. It's just that there's so much of it. And I think that's an important point to make, because with Morrison, it's like, okay, with Final Crisis, what took me, I'll just use myself as an example. Like, what took me a little while to really kind of get a good handle on, right? Especially when we get into the Superman Beyond of that story, is this whole idea of, kind of the overvoid, being this metaphor for the blank page of a comic book, and this idea that, like, someone's drawing on the page and there's a reaction to it, right? And what that means for us as readers, and what that means in the context of the story, right? So that's the sort of thing that I'm kind of pointing to. Whereas here, again, I think there's just a lot. Like, there's just a lot going on here. I remember going back to Sixth Dimension, we talked about kind of the control room and all of that. I remember when we get to, what we ultimately find out is that the future version of Superman who's at play in that story is actually the World Forger in disguise. And he's hatched this whole plot, right? He wants to stop Perpetua. His idea is to essentially supplant our universe with one that he's created here. And he's utilizing Mixiospitalik. I actually just got a Mixiospitalik pop, and you can't really see it, but it's on the shelf behind me here. But to essentially unmake the world, and then when that has achieved a certain completion status, the World Forger will smash his hammer on his Crisis anvil, and that will allow this new universe that he's created to descend and to take the place. And I remember just getting to Crisis Anvil, and I was like, God damn it, man. Like, enough. It's like, enough. It's enough. But anyway, so that's one piece of it. But going back to, again, kind of this coordination, editorial clarity, and planning, and the doomsday clock of it all. So I have, I guess, like some competing thoughts, I suppose, where there's the more practical, and then there's the more thematic and big picture. So as far as the practical, and look, whether I like it or not, I will give Snyder props for at least trying to address Doomsday Clock, because he could have not. He could have just ignored it completely, right? But he actually did make a couple of attempts. Now, I guess I'm kind of annoyed at the way it played out, because I really did enjoy Doomsday Clock, and I found it emotionally resonant, and I got something out of it. But he could have skipped it entirely, and he didn't, so hats off. But so at the very end of his Justice League run, where, again, Perpetua has turned everyone towards doom, our heroes have lost. They've lost. And they've been summoned by the Quintessence, and they're sort of laying out the state of things. And one of the things that the Quintessence says is that events that unfolded outside your purview, some disconnected from your reality altogether, but still deeply felt and impactful. And the image that accompanies that caption is the thunderbolt passing through Black Adam, which we see in Doomsday Clock. So events that unfolded outside your purview that affected they're disconnected from your reality, but still felt and impactful. So I feel like that's a pretty clear statement that what we were seeing in Doomsday Clock was kind of its own thing. And, this came up last week when I was talking with Tyler from Krypton Report all about Doomsday Clock. And he in particular was like, yeah, like, how does this fit in? And what does it mean? And this and that. And, we do get somewhat of an answer here. And then, so that's number one. And then this one pissed me off. I'm sorry. When we get to death metal, again, at this point, Earth is a hellscape. The Batman who laughs, who's on his way to becoming the Darkest Knight, he has usurped Apex Lex as the right-hand man. And of course, he has his own designs. But essentially, he's brought the forces of the dark multiverse to bear in the main DC universe. And Wonder Woman is like queen of hell, essentially. She's on the Themyscira, and she's forced to run this prison. And one of the new prisoners is Wally West, who, I'm not doing that episode. That's a whole other episode about his journey post-rebirth. But essentially, the short version is that in that Flash Forward miniseries, he sat on Metron's Mobius chair, which had been imbued with the powers of Dr. Manhattan, and he achieved this sort of cosmic status and cosmic awareness. And so he's kind of I should do like a super cut of these breaks because I'm just like it's so
Yeah.
much. But so there's this double page spread of Wally explaining the nature of crisis to Diana. And one of the things that comes up in this is Wally says, not long ago, a being from another reality brimming with connective energy, Dr. Manhattan, tried to mend the fractures in our multiverse, to heal the scars of former crises. Now, is that your understanding of what Dr. Manhattan was doing in Doomsday Clock?
No, no, it's not.
He
And
was changing things out of cold curiosity. This guy showed up and he was like, "Oh, it's weird that Superman arrived in 1938 and 1956 and 1986 and 2006. And every time Superman's timeline shifts, the whole universe shifts with him. What is that about? Well, I'm going to move this lantern and see what happens." Like that's what that was. And it's important because he comes to this world with that coldness and that detachment. And he is ultimately inspired by Superman.
inspired. Yes.
He is inspired by Superman. He sees the face of the man of tomorrow and he is inspired and it's beautiful and he fixes things, right? And we reconcile the new 52 with the rebirth content, all that mechanical business, but right? He's inspired. Like it's important. But here apparently he was just changing. He was trying to help. Wasn't that
But there
clear?
was, yes, and there was an emotional core to it, right? Because if anyone has any affection for Superman, then yes, the mechanical stuff is accomplished, but it's accomplished through an emotional road. It's accomplished through, to take another phrase from Jeff Jones, an emotional tether that people have for Superman and his foundational importance to superhero storytelling itself. That's what Doomsday Clock was trying to be about, and I feel largely succeeded at being about. In addition to a statement about the strength of the Superman character, it was also a statement about overcoming a sort of clinical cynicism that I think is easy for a lot of people to fall into. You know, there was an emotional through line that I think was far easier to detect. In death metal, the emotional components of the storytelling, at least in my estimation, are moment to moment, and don't necessarily coalesce together until you reach, or maybe even arguably they just don't coalesce. There's a bigger emotional moment that is waiting for you at the end, but you know, it's a cumulative story. You have to read everything in order to get to that point specifically, in order to go on the journey that the creators intend us to go on and to leave us with effectively. So yeah, I mean, losing the emotional through line, I think, is it highlights the core fundamental differences in the kind of storytelling at play. And also too, you know, this is more of I guess a mechanical component of the reading experience, but there is so much ancillary material that you don't necessarily need. And I mean, even compared with, let's go back to Final Crisis. The ancillary material in Final Crisis, while the main series was coming out, was restricted to, you know, I think two or three other writers. You know, the Revelation series was written by Greg Rucka. Johns was doing, he did Rage of the Red Lanterns, although those tangentially related to Final Crisis, but he also did Legion of Three Worlds, that has more of a tie to Superman Beyond, but it was mostly just a continuation of things that Johns himself had been doing. Rogue's Revenge was also Johns, and that, since that was tied into Flash, that was pretty important to Final Crisis overall. But all the important extra material was written by Morrison. And to your earlier point, the consistency all combines into something that is easy to read, so much so that I think the Essential Edition that you read and the Absolute Edition that I have includes all of the stuff written specifically by Morrison, and it makes for a more complete reading experience. The ancillary stuff in death metal, you know, Snyder does have a pretty important part to play in a decent amount of it, but the volume, uh, does not have a lot to do with the core story that he is telling. Uh, and like even some of the stuff that Snyder is involved in doesn't have a lot of essential components to the narrative, and it just makes it far more unwieldy. I would like, as a retailer, when Final Crisis was coming out, I I had to do a lot to try and keep people subscribed to it, but also just to earnestly walk people through who really did want to keep up with things, because it was kind of hard for some readers to keep up with, and I empathized with that, and tried to show them a path. And with death metal, if I was working as a retailer during that event, it's messiness is akin to what you regularly see from the X-Men. It's not a smooth process to try and bring people along for that ride. And I feel like it didn't need to be so sprawling. And I mean, it's true of metal as well, but with this, I mean, I feel like there could have been a lot more focus than we ended up getting.
Listen, I agree wholeheartedly, and I was going to save this for next week, but I'll say it now. I mean, I think in my heart, after rereading and reading everything for this event, in my heart, Infinite Crisis remains number one for the personal attachment that I have, but also now giving it a fair shake with the benefit of so many years, and it held up amazingly. At the same time, again, though, it flows so much from everything that had been set up, and that again, I think that cuts both ways. For I think largely, especially if you're following all of it, it's a huge positive, and it was such an exciting time when all of that was coming out. I think it might make it a little bit harder to give to someone cold, right? If you haven't had a lot of the background. Whereas part of me, and maybe I will save my final superlatives for next week, but part of me feels like Final Crisis might be the perfect crisis or the best crisis. And in part I say that because I genuinely do think, as much as within the pages of that essential edition that you're reading, you have to work with it. But it's not that you have to know everything that's going on around you in the DC universe. And whether or not that's a positive, people's mileage may vary, right? Because part of the fun of a crisis is, can be, it's not always, but it can be the tie-ins, it can be the lead up to it, right? So if you like that, then I think probably Infinite Crisis is is number one. But if you want something where you can just give someone like one thing and say, hey, you're going to spend some time with this, but this is going to give you a pretty amazing statement on the DC universe and these characters and what they mean and what they can do. It might be Final Crisis. Whereas again, yeah, I agree totally with you with death metal. Um, I read a lot of the tie-ins. So if you go on the DC app, and that's how I read all of this, they have it organized. I think it's 19 issues or so, the death metal series, and they have everything seemingly in the correct order. And even the ones that I thought would be would be more critical, like the Trinity Crisis or Trinity War, whatever it's called, that Snyder wrote. I think Francis Manifold did the art. That's where Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman venture into the dark multiverse to these crises that are still happening there to try to capture or redirect the anti-crisis or the crisis energy. Um, even that, I enjoyed it, but if you had skipped it, you got everything you needed in issue 4 of Death Metal or whatever. So yeah, I don't know. I agree with you on that front for sure.
Well, and in terms of volume as well, I mean that the last 52, which was I think the last tie-in issue before Death Metal number 7, is 80 pages long. The page counts vary wildly from from the main series into the tie-in material. And one of the problems that I always ran into as a retailer, when the companies would put out these big crossover events, you inevitably get at least a few people who just say, put me down for everything, because they don't want to miss any critical components of the story, right? They think that, well, if it's on the little brochure that they sent to all the comic shops, those are essential chapters that you need to read. And our responsibility as retailers is to say, no, here's where you can, if you like this character, read this tie-in. You'll get the most out of it if you do that. This side of things, it doesn't really conform to the stuff you normally check in with, so you could probably push it to the side. None of that stuff is going to be super essential to what's going on. That's how it was, at least for Final Crisis and for Infinite Crisis and even Secret Invasion, although that was kind of a sprawling event too. But when it comes to events like metal and death metal, it would have been very difficult for me as a retailer to parse out exactly what's important and where it's important. Because, like you said, the writer of the main series is involved in some of these things that aren't necessarily super important to the core narrative. So, how do you guide someone in good faith to try and get the things that they actually need to get the most utility out of the story? It's uh, I don't wanna say it's deceptive because I don't think it necessarily is deceptive, but it does make it more difficult to follow, especially for people whose job it is to guide customers through to find what they need from the stories.
Yeah, no, that's totally fair. I identify with a lot of that. I mean, it's been quite a few years now since I was behind the counter, but no, I mean, I can I can imagine what, what this would have been like
Oh,
to try to help
yeah.
navigate people through it. Going back to the doomsday clock of it all. So again, I think it's more than fair to have this conversation because of how close in time all of these events were. I mean, and we talked last time about how, again, Doomsday Clock was vastly delayed. It ended up taking just over 2 years for what was originally intended to be a 1 year story. And clearly, a lot of shifts going on at DC in terms of their personnel and the direction. And I think there were a lot of factors kind of at play here. But, when it comes to Doomsday Clock in particular, uh, I guess I agree with what you were saying before that I think they do ultimately have different aims, and death metals is certainly grander. I mean, and just to sort of illustrate this for people like, what exactly do you mean? I feel like with death metal, and Snyder talked about this in interviews too, but it's there in the work. This idea of memories being restored, right? This idea, and he talked about this in an interview. He's not saying that Superman remembers being Red Sun, right? Red Sun was always an Elseworld story. But the idea is that anything that had happened within the DC universe, even if that story previously had been retconned or undone by a crisis event, like that's now part of this history that the characters share. And as a further example, when we're in the Justice League run, there's a portion of the story where the team they have the World Forger on their side, which I thought was a nice touch in Sixth Dimension, where he starts off as this antagonist, and that typically goes one way, but the League is like, "Well, work with us." Like that's the one thing that Perpetua hasn't counted on. Like, work with us, join the Justice League, right? And then they seek to enlist the Monitor and the Anti-Monitor, right? I thought that was cool. And when they find the Monitor on Nil, right, they revisit this world from Final Crisis that we had spent time on, Superman Beyond, and all of that. When the Monitor sees Barry, he references Barry's death during the crisis, and Barry has some line about like essentially, yeah, I kind of remember that, or an echo of that, and it's always been. I've been meaning to bring this up, and like all of these episodes, every time I'm done with an episode, I'm like, oh damn, I meant to bring up that. This is the thing. It's this weird thing with Crisis on Infinite Earths in particular, where characters memories of it and their understanding of it is seems to be very limited. Like they know there was a battle. Seems like they know Anti-Monitor was the antagonist, but they don't seem to really grasp exactly what was at stake or their lot like the full scale of their lives before that. Like there's this vagueness to their memory. It's like, oh yeah, Barry died in that crisis. And that's kind of what they know. So this idea in death metal by the end that they have this clarity, right, about what's happened, I think that is a distinct feature to death metal. However,
Yes.
and this is my problem, especially with how Doomsday Clock and death metal interact, is that even though there is a distinction and I recognize that, I feel like ultimately at their core, they are getting at the same basic idea of, especially with when we get to Doomsday Clock, right at the end, this idea of the metaverse and the idea that every time the DC universe changes, right, this new world is created to preserve, to quote unquote preserve every era of Superman, right? So when Barry Allen arrives on the scene in 1956 and kicks off the Silver Age. Earth 2 is created to preserve the Golden Age Superman. By the end of Doomsday Clock, we've restored the pre 52 timeline, but now Earth 52 exists out there to preserve the new 52 era of Superman. And so I feel like this is a lot to do with saying, hey, all of these versions of the characters that you've had, they're still out there to be explored, to tell stories with. It all matters. And I feel like the "it's all matters" piece is such a huge part of what Snyder is doing. Like, all of these stories matter. And so again, I feel like at their core, both of these stories are like kind of saying the same thing. Just as I don't mean to belabor the point, I've been talking about it over the course of this event, but it's like Mark Waid and Grant Morrison gave us hyper time in the 90s. Like, they
Yeah.
gave us a way to just have all of this already. But that's, oh, by the way, we we learn in the Snyder's Justice League run that the World Forger, he made hyper time, by the way. He made it.
Yeah.
He made it. Again, if you ever had a question about how anything works in the DC universe, just read these stories, because
Yeah.
you have no questions by the time you're done. So we've had this, but anyway, within these a span of these couple of years, we have these two stories. Like, I feel like saying the same thing, and mileage will vary. People will disagree. Again, for me, Doomsday Clock did it in a more elegant way. That, look, bias is showing, but it was about Superman at its core, so that counts
Yeah.
for a lot. And again, I think it was grounded in more emotion. And so again, this is less of a knock on Snyder himself and more on DC for, I think, having these kind of not contradictory, but overlapping yet not syncing up events. I feel like this was a misstep on their part.
Yeah, and it's funny because the idea of everything counting, that of course was the core conceit of Grant Morrison's Batman run. Going
Right.
into that first issue, the idea was that Morrison spoke about was that everything that has been published in Batman's publication history has happened over the course of one man's extraordinary life. I think, paraphrasing, but that's basically what Morrison said. And so what Snyder is doing, I mean, if there are people who think that he's something of a Morrison revivalist, that's not taking any ammunition out of that argument. He is literalizing the core conceit that defined Grant Morrison's Batman run and kind of canonizing it within the DC universe. Now, is that bad? No, I don't think that that's bad. I mean, if anything, Morrison's run proved that it just expands the tapestry on which you can tell stories with these characters and you can go to really unexpected places. But when I go back and when I say that Grant Morrison's my favorite comic book writer, one of the reasons that I always have said that is because when you read a Grant Morrison comic book, unless you're psychic, it's virtually impossible to predict how a story is going to play out. That being said, going from the beginning of death metal to the end of death metal, I certainly couldn't have predicted how this is going to go, but there is a core difference in that Morrison has always given service, even with a lot of the expository information that could be tiring for some readers. Morrison always prioritized the emotional intent of the stories that he was telling and always understands the cores of the characters being written in the stories. If you want to go to New X-Men, Scott Summers is like Scott Summers, Wolverine is like Wolverine. You go to JLA, I mean, a lot of people believe that the relationship between Kyle Rayner and Wally West, that was defined by Morrison and JLA. Or, Batman, the Joker, I think is one of the best characters when in the hands of Grant Morrison. But the emotional side of death metal was not as much of a priority until the end. At least I felt, in comparison with a quote unquote, even though you really can't ever apply this adjective to it, typical Grant Morrison story. The emotional component of it is so key and critical. Consistency whether you want to talk about artistic consistency, as in the artwork itself, or in the ideas being presented over the course of a story, are also critical to it. Death metal was generally pretty consistent, and I think Greg Capullo being involved in the main series, at least up until the very ending moments, uh, definitely helps with that. But again, it just goes back to that idea of plot swallowing character, because where do we get the emotions from? We get them from the characters. We don't have it without the characters. You can tell this impossibly cosmic, wide scale story, and if you don't have people with beating hearts at the center of it, it's just not going to punch you in the face as hard as I think even just the narrow components of Superman Beyond do, or the end of Doomsday Clock does, or the end of Infinite Crisis does. These are the kinds of stories that reach the heights of the DC universe, bring all the characters together, ideally because they want to stir in us why we love them in the first place. And I didn't feel that in certainly in metal until probably the end of it. In death metal, it came a little bit sooner, thankfully, but it wasn't as much of a it didn't have as much or as prominent a role as I would have preferred.
That's beautifully said. Beautifully said. And this is maybe more of a question for off mic, but I think it's relevant to what we're talking about here. And I love the way you put it as far as canonizing, right, aspects of Morrison's ideas. I absolutely love Morrison's take on the Joker in that Batman run. This idea that the Joker changes over time, sheds his skin and evolves and plagues Batman in different ways. To me a perfect way of sort of encapsulating or reconciling all these different versions of the Joker that we've had over the years. He's changing, right? He changes.
Wasn't it fun when he just decided to stop killing people for a few months and did a bunch of zany pranks? And it's like, hey, there's Silver Age Joker. Yeah.
And it to me it works. It's very elegant. And then you have Jeff Johns come along with Three Jokers, and look, it's an intriguing read. The art is absolutely gorgeous. Uh, but there's something that I've always bumped up against that, where it's like we have what I feel like is a wholly satisfying explanation for the changes in the Joker thematically. And then you have Johns come along and he's like, no, hey, no. There's just three of them. It's like, I don't, yeah, how is that better? How is that bad? I feel like that takes away something. And that leads to the other big problem that I had. There are many, but with death metal in that double page spread. By the way, the number of times that I scrolled on my iPad as I was reading these events and I saw a double page info dump of DC cosmology. It was just, to echo something that Superboy Prime said, there was a point, and I got past it because the world building subsided slightly as we got deeper into this. But through Metal and the beginning part of the reading for this, there was a stretch there where I was experiencing exactly what Superboy Prime was talking about, where I wasn't caring. And I hate that. It's one thing if I'm like, I don't agree with this, or this could have been done differently, whatever. I'm okay because I'm still engaged. There was a point for a little while there where I just felt like I don't care. I don't care. You're just throwing so much stuff at me. Anyway, but in that double page spread with Wally explaining how crises work to Diana, that there are these two poles, there's crisis, there's this connective energy, all this stuff. He talks about how Perpetua, for all this time that she's been trapped in the source wall, has been whispering in the ears of those who have instigated crises in the past. And we see Parallax and we see Darkseid from Final Crisis. And we see, I don't know if we see Alexander Luthor or Superboy Prime, but like the past crises are represented there. And this notion that she's been subtly influencing them. Now, I had a big problem with this. And this goes back to what I was saying before about over explaining and drawing lines where we don't need lines. And I feel like the counter argument, fair enough, could be, hey, you're taking this too literally, right? It's just more, there are these forces at play in the universe. But the way it's laid out there, it's pretty explicit. And for me, the idea that to any extent these characters, it's like going back to near and dear to us, Infinite Crisis. It's like Superboy Prime was already being influenced by Alexander Luthor. We don't need we don't need another force. And whether it was again, however literal or figurative you want to play it, any level of influence being exerted on these characters to sort of say, hey, this is why Parallax initiated Zero Hour. This is why Darkseid. It's like, no, no, no. Like, they did what they did because that's who they are and that's what they do. And so that to me was and this is where I say I feel like this is a fundamental disagreement. I respect Scott Snyder. If I ever meet him, I'd be happy to shake his hand. But it's like I have a fundamental disagreement with this.
Yeah, well, and I can attest to Scott Snyder being an extraordinarily nice person to meet. I've met him at a few conventions. Always very giving with his time, and certainly also a fan. You know, enthusiastic about things that you might share with him at a convention. But no, I agree with you. I mean, consider, and maybe this is hyperbolic language. I don't know, but consider all of the other characters that single factoid removes agency from. Darkseid, Alexander Luthor, Parallax. I mean, we've learned so much about Parallax over the years, especially once John's got a hold of the Green Lantern sub franchise, and there was already like quite a lot of good solid understanding of so but then that just throws like another thing in. So how long has Perpetua been in the ear of the Parallax entity for eternity, or has she just been in the ear of Parallax when attached to Hal Jordan, or has she been slowly sort of did she make Hal Jordan susceptible to the possession by Parallax? It's too much. So then another thing is too, in certain situations, if the heroes are going through obviously Perpetua meets her fate in this story, but presuming she didn't, in some future event, could they not just trace the cause of whatever crisis they're battling to her? And I mean, it's like a reverse Deus Ex Machina, although we should talk about Deus Ex Machina once we get to the end of the story. But it's just like that effort to explain everything and to have a puppet master actually retroactively simplifies the stories that we've already read. And I don't know how you could necessarily think that's a good thing for and look, I'm not part of your you killed my childhood crowd or anything like it, but the retcon, how are you forced to read those old stories now when you revisit them? Oh, well, Darkseid didn't really just want anti-life. He was influenced by Perpetua. What? That's like Doctor Doom crying in that issue of Amazing Spider-Man. It's just, it doesn't fit.
Yeah, and I feel like if the whole if the whole thrust of this is everything matters, I feel like this undermines that because I feel like it definitely takes away. And I mean, look, Hal Jordan is a perfect example to illustrate our point here because it's like this guy's already being influenced by Parallax, as we've learned. It's like now you're telling me that even that Parallax entity is being influenced by Perpetual. It's like, come on. And all like depending on what lens you look at this, like we're looking at this, or I'm looking at this like from a Superman perspective. What little there is here. Has when we catch up with him in the death metal hellscape, he's got the long hair. He's been imprisoned on Apocalypse. He's been bombarded with every different variation of kryptonite imaginable, as well as anti-life. So he's really he's really on the ropes there. But like if you're looking at this as a Hal Jordan fan, I don't know how you feel. How you feel about this. You probably have strong feelings about the parallax of it all. But then you add this on top of it. It's like, at what point are we just like losing sight of the character, right? I mean, because
Yeah.
like now it's retcon upon retcon, and I don't mean to dwell on this, but literally Parallax is one of the characters in that double page spread, and so I really fixated on that because when you read Zero Hour the first time, Hal Jordan had a fundamental disagreement with the Guardians. right? He wanted to save Coast City, and they refused, and he rebelled. And he now has decided, I'm going to remake everything. I'm going to fix it. It'll be better. And that there, I think there's an argument to be made. That's a compelling that's a compelling turn for the character, as divisive as it was at the time. Then later you find out, okay, he wasn't in full control, right? There was this parallax entity corrupting him, and I think, we maybe it's debatable. Was he, is he fully possessed? Was he just being influenced? All right, but now on top of that, you have this other force. So again, it really it bums me out. With going back to Snyder, it's funny. I was driving in the car the other day with my wife, and I was saying to her, I was like, because it was right after I had done the metal recording, and I was like, man, like I feel kind of bad. I'm like, I don't. It doesn't bother me so much. We always keep it polite, right, and respectful, and all of that. But I have an easier time kind of taking down when we covered Superman Year One by Frank Miller. I really did not care for that. And at no point did I worry like, oh, if Frank Miller ever heard this, he'd feel bad, because there's such a removal in terms of generations apart. He's this larger than life figure, and he feels more like quote unquote fair game, right? Where I'm like, it's fine.
Sure.
He can take it. With Scott Snyder, where I don't know his exact age, but we are relative contemporaries. And he, like, one of the comic shops that I featured in my documentary film, My Comic Shop Country, poster over my shoulder there. He and Tom King just appeared at their 30th anniversary convention event that they did, which was really cool in New Jersey.
That's awesome.
Very, very
Yeah.
cool. It's like I might cross paths with him at some point. It's like, and so there's this part of me that and it's not that I'm pulling my punches. I'm still being honest, but there is kind of that aspect where maybe it is the sort of the contemporary aspect where I just sort of feel like, it, I don't want to come across as like so overly critical, I guess.
Well, no, I mean, look, I think it's prudent to point out as well that we should remember that death metal is the end of Snyder's DC output, right? I mean, compare it with the beginning of his DC output. The Black Mirror in particular, uh, that was a career making story. It made everybody turn their head and pay attention. And then more people paid attention when his name was on Batman #1, the first time we'd seen Batman #1 since 1940. Like, it's a big deal. And naturally, I think there is going to be an energy there. And I don't think that he necessarily lost energy, but he did end up doing so much over the course of his time at DC, particularly just pouring an idea after idea into Justice League, that I feel like it's plausible that he may have felt the way I need to go out is by going as big as I possibly can. And he certainly did that. And I don't want to take away from the character moments in here that do stand out. I was genuinely surprised that it didn't I wasn't spoiled ahead of time, and since I finally finished reading this series for this discussion, I was genuinely surprised when Batman says I'm dead.
Yeah.
And we didn't see that, of course, and it was only telegraphed lightly in a few places. Like, someone touched him earlier in the story and said, "You're cold as ice. You need to rest." And like, "I'm fine. I'm fine." But that was a surprising moment, and it did end up providing, at least for me, a sense of coming up against the end. I don't know how much or as little or as maybe you're a huge gamer. I don't know.
I'm not.
Uh, okay, so there's a game that I actually think is the best example of a prequel ever. It's like the construct of the prequel itself is defined by Red Dead Redemption 2. Is a incredibly emotional experience. There's a song that recurs through that game that sort of punctuates the more emotional moments of the main character's life. And the lyrics are, "May I stand unshaken amid the crash of worlds." And in those moments, I started to hear that song play in my head, because you are getting the sense it's written authentically in a way that everybody feels like this is the end. And some of those moments at the very end of the story where Wonder Woman or Sergeant Rock is narrating the final moments of the final battle between Wonder Woman and the Darkest Knight, and saying that's the moment when you push through and you fight through, even without the possibility of victory or even recognition. You push through. And that's when I started to feel it, and when I started to feel like the legwork that went into getting to this moment was starting to pay off. It was maybe diminished a little bit by the end, and we can talk about that. But still, it was a moment that did feel real to me, even though I've read, 1,000 of these events before. They all feel, but I do love those instances where we do get to sort of quiet down, check in with how these people are feeling before the final battles. But like in Final Crisis, there's a great one shot called DC Universe Last Will and Testament, written by Brad Meltzer, that did the same thing, and is one of the things that I really do love about all the stuff in Final Crisis that was not written by Grant Morrison. And we got some of that in Last Stories of the DC Universe, which is a one shot associated with death metal that did have some cool stuff. I loved a moment in there between Hal Jordan and Sinestro, for instance. And we got to see some cool moments with Green Arrow and Black Canary. There's a nice ending Superman story in there written by Mark Waid. But that's when this story to me was the strongest, when we can emotionally understand what they're fighting through, and the reinforcing the selflessness that you have to have if you're going to be a hero making progress against an enemy like the Darkest Night.
Yeah, I mean I did enjoy that Mark Waid short story, where Superman uses elements of the time sphere and Kryptonian technology to essentially give himself an extra hour, right? So he ends up being in multiple places at once. Long story short, as he's helping and instilling hope across the world while still also being able to spend time with Lois and John. So like that was cool. In I think it's Death Metal itself, he has a reunion with Lois on the battlefield, and I don't. Now I'm getting nitpicky, but it's a very beautiful sentiment that he expresses to Lois, where he's like, "Thank you for our life and for our son and for being my world," or some version of that. And she's like, "Thanks for being the best lead a reporter could ever ask for." It's like, all right, I mean, I guess I don't know if we were trying to kind of undercut the the drama of it. I don't know. And kind of on that note too, where I feel like even at the very beginning of Death Metal, there's a caption that says, Themyscira, the DCU, yes, the real one, right? There are a lot of kind of like cheeky moments like that, and captions and editors' notes where, they're kind of, I guess, kind of like poking fun at the thing that we all do as comics fans. Like, okay, how does this fit in? What does this mean? It bothered me. It bothered me a little bit because you're I feel like the irreverence of those little bits. I feel like that's not. It's kind of unjustified given what you are asking everybody to learn and buy into with the rest of this story. It's like, don't give me double page spread after double page spread about crisis anvils and omniverse control rooms and then make fun of me for wondering if we're on the real DC universe. It's like, F off with that. I like that really annoyed me. It's like if this had been a different kind of story where it wasn't all about this world building, fine, we can have some fun with it. But it's like don't ask me to do the amount of homework that you're asking me to do and then make fun of me for doing it. I like maybe I'm being overly sensitive, but after a while, and not that there's so many instances, but there were enough where I just felt as if, okay, cool it, cool it with that.
I mean, the cheekiness seems like, my guess is that it was their attempt to create sort of a hallmark, like we're going to tell these big stories, but we're also going to have a little bit of fun with it and wink at the camera where necessary. But I mean, you know better than anybody right now because you've absorbed these crises back to back to back. I mean, I don't blame you for feeling the way that you do. These stories, generally speaking, are pretty heavy, most especially, if you're invested in these characters. Like they're being put through things, and in the hands of the best creators, like it's excruciating to see and to read and to feel and to experience along with them. And then, maybe some tonal inconsistency. I get what they were going for, but yeah, also for me, swing and a miss.
We have to talk about Lex Luthor. Now you mentioned you used Doctor Doom as an example from that 9/11 Amazing Spider-Man issue. I remember that well, and I remember the reaction to that moment of him crying. But it made me think of another Doctor Doom moment. So my heart is with DC. I've only ever read one Fantastic Four run, but it was the Mark Waid, Mike Wieringo run, and I love it. I still hold it up as one of my favorite runs of anything. But there was that unthinkable arc with Doctor Doom during that run where he embraced magic. And even though I didn't have a background in the character of Doctor Doom, like I recognized, oh, like this is a big shift for the character, right? That he is now taking this different path, right? And he recounts his history. I mean, it's been years since I read it, but he recounts his history, and you think it's going one way, where he's expressing regrets, and you think it's about, oh, I took the wrong turn, and it's like, yeah, he feels like he did, but it wasn't that he should have gone down a better path. He just feels like he should have turned to magic instead of science to achieve his evil aims. you know, maybe on a similar note here, this idea of Lex Luthor bowing before Perpetua, uh, dying for her, being reborn, merging with Martian Manhunter, his DNA to become this apex predator. He eventually comes around and in the end aids our characters. He obtains the death metal with the help of Lobo that allows Diana to return to the World Forge, and she uses her lasso to become this metal being. Anyway, uh, going back to the Lex of it specifically, uh, I mean, did this track for you with any version of Lex that you know?
I didn't really think of it in terms like that as much as I just felt like this isn't my Lex. I didn't necessarily feel like it was invalid, although you could definitely argue it is incongruent with a great portion of Lex Luthor stories. But I don't know if Lex was necessary to slot into that part. Maybe it could have been just a detail as simple as we need a bald guy because this is going to be Martian Manhunter by the end of this story. So just make him a bald guy. But I mean, Martian Manhunter is a shapeshifter, so maybe not. But no, I mean, the most compelling Lex Luthor stories, again, I think it gets back to that question. We talked about it before of stakes because, invoking such high stakes beyond the comprehension, arguably, of someone even as vastly intelligent as Lex Luthor, uh, just doesn't feel like the best use of the character. I mean, it's more isolated to Sixth Dimension and the Justice Doom War than it is to death metal itself. But no, I mean, this is a long way of saying that it does not necessarily align with the most value that I extract from the Lex Luthor character as an antagonist for the world's most powerful being. It's just it he wasn't necessary to play that part. There arguably could have been more appropriate people. Maybe a new god would have kind of made more sense, but Lex himself, I mean, you and I read Black Ring, and even when encountering death itself, Lex thinks in very small self-interested terms. It's one of the things that's so frustrating as a fan, like if you're rooting for him to maybe make some sort of massive self-realization, he just seems utterly incapable of thinking beyond what he can acquire and what things cost. So slotting him in here, I get it. It brings it up to sort of an all-star level, so to speak. Not all-star Superman, all-star baseball level, so to speak. But yeah, it doesn't align with the guy I know.
I'm glad you brought that up. So, for audience, if you don't remember, if you haven't listened to it, Chris came on a while back. We did an episode on the Camelot Falls arc by Kurt Busiek and Carlos Pacheco, as well as the Black Ring storyline. This was pre 50 New 52 by Paul Cornell and Pete Woods. And I'm glad I had forgotten it in this moment, but I was thinking about it as I was reading, and I was like, oh, I'm so glad Chris is on for this, because like we talked about that story, the Black Ring, where he had experienced the Orange Lantern power, right, in Blackest Night, and then he was on this quest for power. The power aspect I totally get. The bending a knee to someone else to get it really, really did not line up with anything. And it's like the story acknowledges that, but it doesn't solve the problem for me, right? Like Snyder has Superman say, like, I've known Lex, like Lex, this isn't you at one point, and in another instance, something like, I've known Lex, he's always been about just believing in himself, but now he's found faith. I mean, I don't know this. I mean, I guess I can respect the idea that, okay, Lex is like Doctor Doom in that Mark Waid story. It's like he is choosing a different path. Like the guy who only ever put stock in himself is now believing in something else, something bigger than himself, and that's what's changed the course of things. I guess I can, but I cannot get on board. And I did a whole like 5 episode swing of episodes a while back looking at how Lex has evolved over the years. And it's funny because I purposely left off this because I knew this was just I couldn't I couldn't just kind of dip into this. It was its own thing. And I'm glad I didn't, because I mean I like it's part of the character's history, but I really struggle with reconciling this with any version of Lex that I know. I will say, because, and not to psychoanalyze Lex Luthor, but he talks about what people were meant to be, right? And we had learned that, again, Perpetua in that prior version of the multiverse that she had created, right, as one of the hands, the celestial hands of the omniverse, right? She was supposed to create this multiverse and then leave, fade away. Her purpose was served, her fulfilled, but she stayed, right? And again, she had used these dark forces instead of the positive forces, and she was focused on these beings that she created sort of being in the moment, living for now, living for themselves, right? This whole idea of the connective versus the opposite. But uh where am I going with this? I lost my train of thought there for a second. Sorry, folks. It's been a long it's been a long ride. It's been a long ride with this. But yeah, I totally lost it. I'll toss it back to you.
Well, look, I think the point is generally well taken, just in the sense that Lex is, I feel like, a microcosm of something that this story does broadly, in that it picks characters for certain roles that maybe don't necessarily jive all that much, but they serve a particular purpose in the story that's being told. So, in that respect, it's just, it's far more detectable, and in that sense discernible, when it's a high profile character like Lex Luthor, who has such a legacy and such an established sense of who he is and the function that he has served in the DC universe since John Byrne turned him into a businessman, arguably. uh, I mean, you can't toss that away. I mean, one of the things that's so critical, and I think important, about canon as a as an idea generally, is that it is a validation of the creators that came before the incumbent creator, right? It's an acknowledgement, it's an inherent acknowledgement of the work in totality, kind of the point of death metal, arguably. Canon itself is an acknowledgement of everyone that came before you and all of the minds and the creations that led to the moment where you get to play with those toys in the toy box. And you know, hard deviations one way or another. There's instances where they can make perfect sense, or there's instances where you could tell that they are conveniently serving a particular moment in the story that you're absorbing. And I feel like that's sort of where Lex Luthor lies here.
Well said. And I know where I was was going with that train of thought, which is if there's any understanding that I can try to grab onto, when Lex talks about what people were supposed to be, these apex predators, again, in this prior multiverse, this human Martian hybrid, that was all about the self and the individual needs and everything, and the power that they wield, and that Lex comes to wield when he absorbs Martian Manhunter. You know, knowing the Lex that we do, right, who's lived in this world where people look to the sky, to this other being with all of these powers, right? And for as much as Lex has amassed in terms of human achievement, right, he doesn't have that, right? He doesn't have that power. The idea, I mean, I don't know that this is even explicitly said, but to whatever extent his choices are kind of fueled by that, it's like, well, we should have, like, humans, myself in particular, Lex, like, should have been the kind of being, right, who wouldn't look to a Superman, right? Like, we could stand toe to toe with Superman. So maybe that, if anything, I could sort of say, okay, I understand. But otherwise, yeah, I mean, I'm glad he ultimately kind of saw the light. But yeah, it was really tough to see him in that role. I also want to ask you. So when we had Grant Richter from the Truth, Justice, and Hope podcast for Metal, he brought this up, and I think it's more prevalent in this part that we read here. The and I don't think Snyder has ever commented on this, as far as I know, but the pretty apparent political allusions that are made in this story when there's all this business about sort of Lex as the spokesperson for Doom, right? Battling for the soul of the people in the DC universe. I mean, I didn't read any of the Year of the Villain stories, so maybe there's more there. In this, you don't really see so much in terms of, or barely anything, as far as the people, like how the people are reacting and what the people are doing. We're kind of more just told about it, but there's a bit in particular that really seems to, I think, give credence to this idea that Snyder was playing on the 2016 election and all of that. But let's see. This is after, kind of that doom sigil has appeared on the earth, and we're at that point in the story where Superman says about Lex, now he's something else. He fights with something far more dangerous than any weapon or dark force. He fights with faith in the evil in people, faith in a selfish, cruel nature. And this is why we've lost. Standing at that altar with my friend, standing with you, we see it now. We lost him because we fought as though he was the old Lex. We took for granted that people would see him for a false hero, see him as the egomaniac he always was. We fought him as he used to fight us. We didn't fight him by enlisting everyone, by believing in them. We hid the truth from them. We tried to win them over. We tried to win for them, not win them over. And whether it's here or somewhere else, Batman literally says we lost the vote. So I don't know, just kind of curious what your reactions were, if that was something that you had in mind as you were reading this.
Sort of. I mean, the thing that jumped out at me more immediately was that I've kind of read this before, and it seemed more potent and certainly graspable when I read the stories leading up to the election of Lex Luthor as president of the United States.
Yep.
One of the underpinning ideas of that entire story was that it never occurred to Superman that people don't see Lex Luthor the way that he does, and underestimating the potential for people to lionize Lex Luthor led him to become the most powerful person, politically speaking, on the planet. So, arguably a more relevant story now, but the sort of modern evolution, I think, again, we get back to scale, muddying the waters when it comes to the allegorical point that could be made. uh its presence is good, but I don't think that it's necessarily fair to hold the idea that I've read this before against this story, because in comics I think there's a higher degree of probability that certain ideas have previously been explored, outside of Grant Morrison, at least for me generally. um but at the same time too, when you do detect that an idea has been explored with these characters before, you inherently, and maybe even against your will at times, will compare the two. So, what was the most potent exploration of an idea like that? For me, it was probably the election of Lex Luthor. But I fully accept and am happy that someone is going to read this story today, and this will be that moment for them. What will they think if they decide to dig in the back issue boxes and go back and read the election of Lex Luthor? Maybe they'll be like, "Well, I read this before in a story that was published later," and they won't end up deriving any meaning. I feel like I'm going on a tangent.
Well, no, man, I'm with you. That's the thing, though. I get it, and that is my same reaction too, right? Because in my mind, it's like, oh well, I read the President Lex story. Like that's if I want my version of that story, that's what I would read. And again, I don't think we see nearly enough here in the pages of what we read, where you really see enough of that effect on the people. Again, it's more that we're told about it. So I think that takes a little away from it. But again, that passage that I read and other instances, I mean, it seems fairly clear that he was drawing on that. But I do think overall I feel like the larger impetus for all of this, or the larger metaphor that we can find, really pertains to mental health. And I,
Sure.
and I know, Snyder has been vocal about, his own mental health struggles and all of that, and dealing with the anxiety. And so I think that's far more prevalent. And this, reading all of this, it's like I want to give Snyder a hug. Like like this idea that's so prevalent through all of this, that we need to be connected. We need to look at the big picture, not just focus on the self and the now, but the collective and the big picture. That's beautiful. And your point is well taken. Going back to the timing of this, that this was uh, I believe it was actually delayed by a month or so. It was going to come out, it was like May 2020 or something, and they pushed it back a little bit. But this was like early pandemic. And even, again, I was reading on the app, but they still had some of the like in-house ads. And the first thing that you see is the maintain social distance art with Batman and Damian, like stay 6 feet apart, stay healthy. So it's like that's the period we were in. And it's like still dealing with all of the political upheaval, regardless of where you land on that, but a lot of political upheaval, and then the pandemic. And so, all of, and couple that with, again, what Snyder has been vocal about with, his own mental health. So it's like, I think you see all of that at play here. And, that certainly resonates. But what you and I keep getting at, right? Like, especially going back to the President-elect story and, referencing the Morrison stuff, I feel like that, I don't know, this cuts both ways, and I don't really have a good answer on it, but I feel like this whole notion of battling for the soul of the people in the DC universe, and again, even this kind of metaphor for depression or mental health issues, it's like I feel like we did see this with Final Crisis. That's what Anti-Life was, right? It was this depressive state essentially where you lost your free will. So I feel like we saw a version of that. And so where I say this cuts both ways is, part of me feels like I'm being a cranky old man, and also one who has now read all of these crisis events or reread them in a short period of time. And so it's sort of highlighting, the repetitive aspects and all of that. But then part of me says, well, that's kind of the point of these, right? You look at all of these events, and I went back and forth on this, because with Death Metal, by the time we get to the end, everything is restarted, right? And we get this, infinite web of multiverses. And I'm saying to myself, oh man, we've seen it with Crisis on Infinite Earths. It was restarted and we had the single universe. And then in Infinite Crisis, it was restarted and we had New Earth, and then the rebirth of the birth of the 52. Final Crisis, reality was unmade and remade. It's like, we've seen this. But then I'm saying to myself, well, yeah, we see it over and over. That's maybe what's supposed to happen in a crisis event. But the other thing is that with, kind of where we are, our tenures as Superman, or just as comics fans generally, and having read all of these events, it's like, I don't know. On the one hand, it's tough because we read things in here, and it just, again, it might feel repetitive, or it might feel like, hey, we've seen a version of this already. So maybe our longevity as fans works against us. But then at the same time, I wonder for someone new reading this, because it builds so much on what came before. And you and I can't answer this, I guess. I'd be curious to any audience member. I don't know if Metal or Death Metal were the first crisis events that you read. I don't know. Would it feel really cool and exciting? And they reference stories that maybe you're not familiar with, but there's enough there that you understand, or would you just feel lost? Like, I genuinely wonder.
I mean, if the reactions to the opening issues of Metal by my former podcast partners were any indication, they because they were new, they were fresh comic book readers. At least when it came to that event, it was a 400 level class, and they were looking for a 101. That was very much the case. Um, yeah, it's an excellent question, and I agree. I don't think that either of us are necessarily equipped to answer it, but I also wonder how many new readers decided to jump aboard with something like death metal. I mean, this seemed like it was very much designed to be a culmination of everything that Snyder had worked on up to that point. But his name is such that it has extreme commercial viability, so it's quite possible that someone decided to jump with this, and maybe they stuck with it from beginning to end. Um, it's hard to say, but I think you and I would both agree that if we're going to try and bring a new reader on board, this is like the last story that you point someone to.
Yeah, that's a and funny enough. So for our next episode, I'm going to have Lord Retail from Acme Comics in North Carolina, and I'm going to ask him. I am curious with honestly with any of these events, but especially these recent ones with the metal stuff and then Dark Crisis. Was he finding any new people coming on board? You wouldn't necessarily think so, but at the same time, we like to think there's always new people, always new people coming
Sure,
on, or
yeah, sure.
or maybe a Marvel. Even if you're not totally new to comics, but I don't know, like let's say you're a Marvel fan and there's something about something here that speaks to you, and you say, "Oh, okay, I'll try this." You'd be fascinated to know what the reaction was. So as we passed the 2 hour mark, there were actually a couple of things I liked. Uh,
Yeah.
Believe it or not, I thought the idea, even though to me it was kind of ridiculous that the past crises were continuing to occur in the dark multiverse as long as people remembered about them. And they were generating this crisis energy that we find out Superboy Prime is feeding or channeling to Perpetua. And that's what our heroes try to redirect to the Mobius chair for Wally to use. And they actually ultimately succeed. But the Batman, the Darkest Knight, a former Batman Who Laughs, was smart enough to reprogram the Mobius chair to redirect the energy to him. But the idea that they have to go back to past crises, I thought that was actually cool. It didn't go. It didn't take the path I expected it to. I guess I was expecting something more akin to Avengers Endgame, where they're playing more in that world. You didn't really get that because right away, what the characters and we learn is that uh, Perpetua slash the Darkest Knight. At this point, I've lost track of who did what exactly, but they've sent the actual original villains down there. Like the people in the dark multiverse in these crises, they're not dark multiverse shadows of those characters. Like they've sent Superboy Prime down there, and Mobius, aka the Anti Monitor, to Crisis on Infinite Earths, and Darkseid to Final Crisis. So that changes the equation really quickly. But the idea of going back to the original crises, I thought was cool. I mean, and maybe if they had gone the endgame route, it would have felt too derivative. But that stopped them before, so part of me feels like we should have just done that. So, but I like that general idea, and I like there was actually a one Superman moment that I was like, yes, where Diana is talking to Superboy Prime, and basically he's been promised if he helps uh, the which one was it at that point? Was he was helping the Darkest Knight? It was the Darkest Knight that he had promised Superboy Prime his own world, right? And that's been his quest from the beginning. He wants to bring back his perfect world. And Wonder Woman is like, no, no, like just think about it. Like we'll bring back everything that's been before. And Prime says something along the lines of, well, yeah, but then any of those worlds could attack us or something like that. It's like it'd be like a shot in the dark. And Diana says, yeah, but isn't that what he is? Superman. He was a shot in the dark. And that sways Superboy Prime. And I thought that was for a second there, I felt like I was back in Doomsday Clock, right? It's like a rocket arrives, the child is loved. Like that shot in the dark, that Hail Mary pass across the stars, as I always like to call it. I thought that was a cool moment. So I like that a lot.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, chances are you're going to elicit a pretty big emotional response if you try to appeal to the idea of Superman in a broad sense and what that means for the foundation of the DC universe. Yeah, that moment certainly stands out to me as well. I also, was it in the main series where Batman and the reanimated corpse of the Batman Who Laughs were like having a Batman off? Like, well, I did this, yeah, but you didn't think that I would have done this to counteract that. What are you thinking? Like, who are you talking to? Like myself. And that was a fun moment too. Like, as someone who has not been particularly enamored with the character of the Batman Who Laughs, and with respect to his insane popularity since he was introduced, um, that was a moment where I thought, okay, I can see that, because metal and death metal, even though death metal arguably, and I think generally speaking, it's easy to observe that Wonder Woman's the main character, like they are both descended from Batman. They are descended from the iconography of Batman and his importance in virtually every other kind of venue and universe that we've seen him in. But there weren't an abundance of real Batman moments over the course of the main story, I felt, until that one. And then what I mentioned before about where he actually does admit that he is dead. The unthinkable finally happened and caught up with Bruce Wayne. That says a lot about the viscerality of what the heroes themselves are facing over the course of this story. And so I certainly appreciated that too. um, Joker, it was like very briefly, I think in the sixth or seventh issue, when the big battle is going on, and the tide is turned to the forces of evil again, and the Joker has his intestines hanging out. I was like, I'll be right with you. Let me just put myself back together. Like, that was fun. That's kind of that dark, harder edged humor that I think Snyder excellently explored in Death of the Family, his first story with the Joker. Um, so those moments were good too. And where the story ends up leaving us, with that sense of possibility, with the sense of wonder, that felt authentic to me. It felt like it was the way that a crisis event should end. Honestly, it did feel like maybe previous crisis endings on steroids, which I think is exactly what it was going for. I can't say I didn't feel like that at the end of the book.
It, in terms of what we know follows Infinite Frontier, I think the end of this lives up to that, and it earns that title. So credit there. Jumping back just for a second to the Justice Doom War, the members of the different teams within the Justice League splinter off through time to try to find fragments of the totality. And so we have a team in the past who encounters the Justice Society, and we're at the point in our continuity here where the Justice Society, the 1940s version, has been erased from continuity. So there's not that recognition there, but you see those, those building blocks between them start to form again, especially between the Green Lanterns and the Flashes. And then in the future, we have our heroes link up ultimately with the Justice Legion A from DC 1 Million, which that was cool. We continue to get really over the top stuff like, Brainiac 1 Million and the Monitor, Anti Monitor, and Master Forger forming the Ultra Monitor. It's, again, it feels like Power Rangers. And I love Power Rangers. I love it endlessly. But at the same time, there's a place for that. But anyway, kind of the past and the future, those team ups I thought were cool. I mean, look, going back to the Doomsday Clock of it all, that story accounts for how the Justice Society is back in mainline continuity. But I guess this story also gives you a path for how they're back in mainline continuity when the timeline is unknotted, as they like to say, right? It's unknotted and the truth is revealed and all of history is restored. So as I guess you can read either as your path back to the JSA.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm glad that you brought that up. My choice of attire this evening is in reference to the fact that I do love the Justice Society of America,
Yes.
and I cannot deny that losing the JSA, maybe that it, like, Johns ends up kind of pushing forward the idea that, hey, if you felt like the heart of the DC universe was missing during the New 52, well, guess who was missing? It was the JSA. So going into death metal, and certainly the fact is, spoiler alert, I suppose, that the final page of the story is the Justice Society of America, did bring a sense of justice. That was a wonderful way to end things, especially considering if you are a JSA fan, you might have felt like you were kind of kicked to the curb or kicked to the side over the past several years. And it's only just recently that they finally got a book back in the hands of Jeff Johns. And so even those promises that were given to us in Doomsday Clock and in Death Metal are only just now over the past few months finally being made good on. And it took Jeff Johns for that book to actually return. Like they didn't give it to another member of the current guard of the DC universe. They went straight to him. So I think that that just says a lot about the importance of the JSA to the DC universe itself and to those warm feelings that we have about the kind of place that it is and the kind of heroic community it has. You can't rip the heart of that out. And DC has finally decided to put it back in.
I mean, how many times do we have to go through this? I mean, like yourself, I'm a fellow fan, and it was that '90s revival, Jeff Johns, David
Yeah.
Goyer, James Robinson, that made me such a fan. And then, yeah, to lose them with the New 52, it was heartbreaking. And I'm glad that now they've returned, and hopefully we don't have to go through this again. So yeah, I mean, that aspect of it was really cool. One last Doomsday Clock follow up. So, I guess what we learn in death metal is that the energy that Dr. Manhattan possesses is that kind of connective anti-crisis energy that we learn about here, and that's what the quintessence imbues the Justice League with for this off-panel fight with Perpetua that they lose. Right. So again, this whole, again, tying everything together, I appreciate the attempt. I did also like at the end of the Justice League run, at the end of the Justice Doom War, the note that it ends on. I mean, in fairness, it's a lead into another story, but just looking at it in and of itself, I mean, it's like the Empire Strikes Back of this story. I mean, it ends on a really down note. They've lost the soul of their world to doom. People's hearts have turned away from justice towards doom. No matter how hard our heroes have justiced, doom still prevailed. And, so sort of the I don't know, whatever statement it's making about it, people I don't want to say people suck sometimes, but like, sometimes no matter what you do, right, you can't break through. And but the fact that the heroes were still charging into battle, that they were still willing to fight, and it was a fight that, again, I'm mixed on whether or not I think this was a good choice, but it's like whether or not we see it. It's like at the end of that run, like just that in a vacuum, that idea of like, hey, we might not see what happens next, but like they're still fighting. I thought that was cool. And then the I guess the final, when we get to the end of all of this and sort of the final test before Diana, and I agree with you. I know it's so deep into the episode that we actually said it, but yeah, I mean, it is a Wonder Woman story. It really is. Just as Metal was a Batman story, that this is a Diana story. And I guess what did resonate was in her, she's imbued now with with the metal from the World Forge and her lasso, right? That is, kind of presented her in this new form, and she's fighting the darkest night. And the other mechanical piece of this is that Perpetua, who has now been defeated by the darkest night, Perpetua had been essentially keeping the celestial hands of the omniverse away, because if they caught wind of this and they came to this reality, they would unmake this and start over just as they had done the first time. And so now with Perpetua out of the way, the hands are coming, right? And the Darkest Night is planning to destroy them. And, Wonder Woman is standing between him and that. And, essentially he tempts her with this idea of like, well, I'll give you a world. I guess similar to the deal he had offered Superboy Prime. Like, you can have a deal, you can start fresh. And her, her kind of the commentary that we get via her captions, it seems to be making a statement about reboots and about something like the New 52, because she says something along the lines of, like a young, fresh world where we don't remember what came before. It's like we've had that before, right? And so, again, kind of the meta nature of this, where we're saying, no, we're not doing that again, right? We're getting to a point where, no, everything has happened and we're opening everything back up and everyone's going to remember what's happened before. So, again, that tracked, and I thought that the choice that was there before her was a valid one. And her decision to defeat the Darkest Night ultimately carries the day when the hand, or one of the hands of the Omniverse, appears in the guise of Golden Age Wonder Woman, and they have this face to face in front of an all white background, just like it was like the Barbie movie. Now that I think about it, like
Yeah,
the end of the
yeah,
movie.
that's true.
So cue up the Billie Eilish, cut the metal,
There
the
you
death
go.
metal music, and cue up the Billie Eilish, and they have this, and they have this heart to heart where I guess under any other circumstance the hands would have just scrapped it all, but Wonder Woman's actions had swayed them sufficiently that again they restore everything. I mean, what was your take on the ending?
I liked it. Crystallizing the point of everything. It did feel sufficiently authentic to me. I mean, arguably, you could call it a Deus Ex Machina, right? I mean, well, certain death is just flipped over by all powerful beings. But I think there is a critical component of the writing where the hands explained that it was Wonder Woman's actions. Everything that we have experienced up until this moment was it needed to take place in order to get to the decisive moment between she and the Darkest Night. So it's less of a Deus Ex Machina in that respect, but I guess it just counts because of how powerful the hands are at the end of the day. That being said, though, Diana is given a choice to choose a greater degree of vibrancy and truth in the final decision, and the recognition that the hands seem to have for the choice that she made and the actions that she undertook. It was nearly a Superman moment in the sense that it is giving service to the Constitution and the importance to the foundation of the wider narrative construct that is the DC universe that Wonder Woman uniquely has. And she has it because she believes in truth, she's compassionate, but that doesn't negate power that she has. She just uses that power judiciously and is guided by the lights of truth and love when she executes it. And everything that happened in those final couple of pages on that white void did give service to those ideas for me. So, you know, it's hard not to love Wonder Woman as a DC Comics fan, I think, and giving her a moment that I think normally has generally been reserved for Superman was a good call.
You're right. You're right. Again, as the host of a Superman podcast, it's like, yeah, it would have been cool if it had been Superman. But no, I agree. I think look, if we're looking at the entire pantheon and we're looking at this Trinity, I think giving her no, you know what I'm processing what you're saying because it's true. When we look at all these other crisis events that we've been looking at, it's again usually Superman or a version of Superman, right? Who kind of has that decisive moment, or even Batman, right, shooting Darkseid in Final Crisis, and of course being on that final page in the cave. Like, one or both of them, right, and certainly Batman when we get into the metal of it all. But yeah, to give Wonder Woman that, I think that was a good call. And look, if the whole theme is truth, like everything that's happened will come to light, right? I think it tracks thematically. So no, I agree. I think that was cool. Look, the idea of an omniverse with infinite multiverses feels like a hat on a hat. It's like I feel like what are we doing at this point? But you know what's so funny when we did our 52 episode, the weekly series, and that's where we learned that this new multiverse of 52 Earths had been created after Infinite Crisis. I said in that episode, I was like, I feel like DC really hasn't done enough with this idea of the multiverse in the modern era. And I take it back. Take it back. Now that I've seen this, I'll retract that statement. We had touched on Superboy Prime earlier. I like that he had this heroic turn after everything he had
Yeah.
been through, and I love the role that Crypto plays in all of this. It's like you said before, it's like everyone is, I mean, rightfully so, pretty disdainful of Superboy Prime after what he's done. But
Hmm.
the dog, right, shows him kindness and goes to him, and when he too is presented with this final temptation, right, of being able to have his own world to play with, he rejects it and he fights back, and he is seemingly rewarded with being back in on his prime Earth, where he's reading these adventures in the page of a comic. Did you take that as an afterlife or an actual Earth sort of thing?
I took it as an actual Earth, as like a telegraph of what the final results of the stories were going to be. But one of the things that I found fascinating about Prime's place in the story is that it doesn't negate any of the delusions that he had during Infinite Crisis or afterward, right? He believes he is doing the right thing. That's the difference between me and you. I've always wanted to do what was right, and you don't. And it's like, yeah, that's in line. That is exactly what he has always believed, and recognizes that, still manages to recognize, I should say, that total destruction is total destruction and is in opposition to everything that you say you have been fighting for.
Yeah, yeah, no, I think that's a great point. I also want to say that while we're talking Prime, things get so bad that the villains and the heroes are working together. Even Cyborg Superman and other adversaries are aligned. I mean, I guess it tracks. The stakes are that high, but it was still a little jarring. I don't know.
Yeah.
Did that bump you at all?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, I have a hard time seeing. I mean, we already mentioned Lex, but Hank Henshaw has a uniquely potent kind of hatred for Superman that arguably Lex doesn't even have. So yeah, that was a little surprising, but I do like the idea of everybody coming together. It's, but again, it's sort of an idea that we got out of Blackest Night as well. Is that, hey, light, this is literally life versus death, and in this case it's literally existence versus nothingness. Similar ideas, but if they happen, I don't know, 11 years apart, maybe that's okay. All things considered.
Fair enough. I promise we are winding down, but
That's
I know I talked about how really don't need all of these lines to be drawn. I will say, look, in fairness, we learned that there was a reason why the Anti-Monitor initiated that original crisis on Infinite Earths, right? The idea that he was originally tasked with keeping the boundaries between the multiverses clear, if I'm understanding this correctly. And then after the Monitor rounded up Anti-Monitor and World Forger, and they stopped Perpetua, and the Source erected the Source wall, it rendered the Anti-Monitor's function moot, right? Because now there was this divider that appeared in every multiverse. So that's why he has this hatred. Because you going back to the original Crisis, which we reread not too long ago, it's like Anti-Monitor. It's fine. It's just fine. It's just kind of this force and this plot device rather than a real character. So this notion of, oh hey, there was actually a little something more going on there, that was fine. That was fine to me. Again, getting to the point where people are whispering in other people's ears, too far. But the
sure.
idea that, oh no, there was actually some bad blood between these two, I was cool with that. Maybe the last question I have for you, and then if there's anything else you want to talk about, but
Sure.
uh, this is probably an unfair question because as we've talked about and as we've seen, right? Any news story, any creator in a shared ongoing universe like we have here, they're always looking to see what's come before and building on what's come before. So this is kind of unfair, but these stories, and you know what, even though I'm a fan of it, I'll lump this in here too for fairness, like Doomsday Clock, something that so directly, builds upon and imitates the style of Watchmen and these metal events that borrow so heavily from Morrison and these other crises. Like, does it do any of these recent stories that we're talking about in particular? Do they border on the line of fan fiction? I guess the counter argument is like it's all fan fiction, but like is there any feel to that, or to put it a different way, do you see any kind of dividing line between these recent kind of crises, metal, Doomsday Clock, death metal, versus maybe the more the ones like we came up with, like Infinite Crisis and Final Crisis?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I feel like, in terms of scale, obviously it's going bigger than any other crisis before this point had. In that sense, I think it does have a lineage to the crises events that we have already absorbed. So in that sense, like it's valid. It's arguably a logical conclusion if you're thinking that everything is going to come in orders of magnitude, right? You can't get bigger than the orders of magnitude that were established here. Although, maybe you and I will read Dark Crisis at the same time and we'll be revisiting a perspective like that. I don't know. But, it's funny. People know that I am well, a few people know. You brought up Discovery Debrief. That's my Star Trek podcast. And I feel like there's multimedia relevance to this question, because this generation of stewards of these franchises clearly have priorities of things that they would like to see or things that they feel they need to correct. They don't get these jobs where they're in charge of the trajectory of these longstanding superheroic or just media icons without having a degree of understanding and arguably, fandom for these properties. There was a series on the air that went for 3 seasons, Star Trek Picard. It's the first time that we've seen Patrick Stewart play Captain Jean-Luc Picard, or in this case, Admiral Jean-Luc Picard, since 2002. The first 2 seasons were very narrowly focused on Jean-Luc Picard himself, absent the other characters that we had gone on journeys with. The crew of Star Trek: The Next Generation. That's the show that Picard was involved in, so we went on those journeys with all of those crew members. Season 3 of Picard is wholly different from the first two. It is effectively a TNG reunion that brings everybody back. And the showrunner of that third season is a guy named Terry Matalas, who is a huge fan of the franchise, who's worked on it since at least 2005 in different capacities. There's like a cameo that he has in an episode of Star Trek Enterprise back in 2005. And he's given a lot of interviews recently where he has talked about, well, in the first Next Generation movie, the ship that we had spent 7 years on the show, on the Next Generation, was destroyed. One of the things I wanted to do is I wanted to pick up those toys that had been discarded and put them back on the shelf and give them the ending I felt they deserved. And granted, a lot of fans probably felt that way too. But Data, played by Brent Spiner, had previously died in other media. Data is back in Picard season 3. It gives a send off that crew arguably didn't have, but it also does in places evoke certain elements of fan fiction. But I do think that, we look at this, we look at death metal and some of the other creations that we're seeing at DC Comics, where creators are either near or in our generation. These are the things that these creators are prioritizing in multiple mediums.
I'm so glad you drew that parallel. I just never really got into Star Trek, but I appreciate the passion for it, and I have enough general knowledge. I know exactly what you're talking about, and that's something that I'm recognizing, and I have to come to terms with. And it's kind of this weird effect where, yeah, Jeff Johns was drawing on what Marv Wolfman had done in the original Crisis when he did Infinite Crisis. Grant Morrison was drawing on Jack Kirby's Fourth World for Final Crisis, right? But I didn't grow up with those prior works. So I don't look at them through that lens. And to me, they feel, even though I recognize that they are building upon what's come before, they still feel fresh to me, right? And I hit them at a younger point in time, and it's just a different experience. Whereas here, yeah, with Scott Snyder in particular, this is a guy, again, I don't have his exact age, but it's like, yeah, he was coming up reading the same stories that we were, and now it's like he has the opportunity to play with them. So I can't begrudge him that. I guess the thing that's weird to me, but I guess maybe this is just the effect of fandom. It's like older fans who might have complained about the stories that we loved, right? It's like, but what's the weird aspect is you would think that stories we loved getting referenced or revisited in the dark multiverse or whatever, like that would be, we would like that, but it's backfiring. It's having the opposite, maybe because we don't want those touched, right? Like they have kind of that special place, or we feel like they achieved their aims in a more effective way. So now seeing another story try to do the same sort of thing, again, even look again with the political aspect of all of this, it's like, yeah, the whole, pointing people towards doom or whatever. But it's like, no, but like we saw, we saw like a more direct parallel to what we experienced in real life in the comics in a really cool way. So maybe it's that. It's weird though. It's so weird.
Yeah, and I mean, I think you even see the parallels in other places too. Like Nick Spencer's Captain America comes to mind, where he actually the world was convinced that he was a Hydra agent all along, but it ended up being a story about confronting fascism effectively. And so these characters are there's a rich tradition of using these characters to try and tell us stories about ourselves. Honestly, that's when the stories resonate the most with me. But the approach seems to couple those kinds of narrative aims with that pre-existing passion that the creators clearly had. And maybe the natural result is that it does feel like our generation's fan fiction, because maybe people like Terry Matalas and people like Scott Snyder were in those forums cutting their teeth on writing fan fiction. It's possible.
I know. And because that's what it, that's what it reads like. It's like, what if, the Anti-Monitor and Monitor were brothers and they had a third sibling and they lived in, the sixth dimension, and there's a crisis anvil, and there are these two poles of opposing forces of energy, and there's an omniverse within which exists infinite multiverses and a dark multiverse. And within the multiverse, we have the metaverse, which, when we get to Flashpoint Beyond, we get that chart from Jeff Johns that like lays this out. So like another attempt now to sort of reconcile all of it. I'll save this for the next episode, but I'll just say real quick, for a while, DC was building towards this 5G event where we were going to have this like century long timeline, and characters were going to be their actual ages and they were going to be replaced by their successors. And when Dan DiDio departed the company, those plans were jettisoned. But I think when you look at death metal, I think you see where that was heading. I think the germ of that is still here, right? Like this unknotted timeline, but you still don't have people again appearing as the age that they like. They didn't go all the way there, but kind of
Right.
unknotting the timeline, and then this generational aspect where, again, we didn't have characters being replaced per se, but we had again, like John Kent is active as Superman alongside Clark as Superman, and on and on through the line. So I think they retained aspects of it. But that's another thing too when we talk about kind of, not even competing or conflicting, but just publishing objectives that were then abandoned. Like I think this was building towards something that then was not done. So I just wanted to mention that really quickly. But
Mhm.
is there anything that we, whether big picture or individual moments, anything that we didn't talk about with this that you wanted to?
I just don't want people to come away thinking that I don't enjoy this story. Like I feel like it's easy to potentially glean that. Look, I'm always going to be down for a crisis level event. You know, a crisis level event, generally speaking, considering the legacy going back to 1985, like they're memorable, they're fun. They put characters that you wouldn't expect to combine into situations that seem novel. So I'll always enjoy these kinds of stories when they come along, but that does not mean that they are all created equal. In fact, a fun postscript episode might be you doing a tier list of crisis events. If you feel equipped to do that, I think you would be arguably more equipped than a lot of other people in the moment if you wanted to do that. But there are some crisis events that just hit better than others. Whether or not timing, I think, is a big part of it. Is this the right crisis, the right kind of story at the right time, considering where the characters are? Um, Maybe not, but I can't argue with what it has led to in terms of bringing sort of new voices into the fold for these long-standing characters, and trying to forge new paths for them. In that respect, I admire death metal for doing what it's done, and I also, like I alluded to before, really admire its ambition. And I do feel like it hits more than it misses, which I didn't necessarily feel about metal. So this is a fun reading experience, but you do need to pedal to keep up with it. You need to pedal harder to keep up with it, arguably, than something as Final Crisis, which we used to think was dense, but in comparison, maybe not so much.
I agree with all of that. And would I go so far as to say I enjoyed this? I don't think I could. I enjoyed this more than metal. But what I will say, and I think this really is important, I genuinely think that Snyder and Capullo, but Snyder in particular, across his Justice League and Death Metal, I think he really achieved what he set out to. Whether that's what I wanted as a reader, that may or may not be the case. But in terms of having an objective and achieving it, I think he did it. And I will give him props for that, because it seems like, and whether you want to call it fan fiction or just creativity or whatever you want to, whatever label you want to put on it, it reads like someone who has read and loved and thought about these characters and concepts for a long time and had a lot of ideas. Like, how wouldn't it reads like, oh, wouldn't it be cool if this, or would it be cool if that? And he had the chance to do that and to tell this story in his way. And so in that sense, it's a success. So, this, this went long. Our episodes generally are long, and these crisis ones in particular, but I hopefully for our audience, even the ones who aren't familiar with death metal, I hope you enjoyed this episode. I think I really enjoyed this. I actually found it really interesting. I found it cathartic in a lot of ways. And I think we really got at some interesting ideas about all of this. And how fitting is it that here we are discussing an event about events. We're in an event, a podcast event, talking about a comic event that's a commentary on other comic events, and we got to have this conversation about, again, just about these. I feel like we're just we're in a cycle here, but I don't know. I got a lot out of this. I thank you so much for your time, both in reading and having this epically long conversation. I'm always happy when we can compare notes. Again, we've mentioned Discovery Debrief and Comic Binge. Is there anywhere in particular you want to direct folks to check those out?
You can check out the Comic Binge is exclusively on YouTube, at least at the moment. So be sure to check out our episodes every Tuesday, usually just live streaming affairs, 8 p.m. Pacific. I think our next one is Spider-Man centric, but we have done rundowns of Infinite Crisis. I actually designed a reading order for the panelists for the pre-material, and then the different bobs and weaves to take over the course of the main series. And that was a fascinating set of discussions. I think leading up to it, we read OMAC Project, and what other minis did we read?
Villains United, Ranthanagar.
We skipped Villains United and Ranthanagar, but I made them read the Day of Vengeance. Yes, thank you. And so and then up through Countdown, of course. My co-host Paul Herman actually thinks the best issues of Infinite Crisis are the Superman tie-in, specifically where Kal-El is battling his Earth 2 counterpart, and I can't really disagree with that. It's pretty solid. But we're going over 52 right now, so be sure to check out the Comic Binge. And then over on Discovery Debrief, we just recently concluded the second season of Star Trek Strange New Worlds, and we have episodes dedicated to all 10 of those. And we're about to dive into the comedy animated series Lower Decks that's currently back on the air. So you can check that out wherever you get podcasts.
Very cool. Well, thank you so much, Chris. Thank you, audience. As always, I appreciate you tuning in. Next week, it is the grand finale of Red Skies. I'll be joined by Lord Retail from Acme Comics in Greensboro, North Carolina, and we will get into the last, for now, but I know it won't be the last one forever, the last for now, and most recent Crisis event, Dark Crisis on Infinite Earths. So make sure you come back for our 13th and final chapter in Red Skies. Until then, as always, it's about what you do. It's about action. This show is part of the Flat Squirrel Podcast Network, home to Digging for Kryptonite, another exciting episode in the adventures of Superman, Summoning the Zords, and My Comic Shop History, available wherever you get your podcasts. Be sure to subscribe and leave a review today. Sign up at patreon.com/Anthony Desiato for additional content. Thank you all.